Okay, hello, hello, hello. Welcome one and all to yet another episode of WhickTV. Oh, all the little Rezzies in chat already, all ready to go, looking good. Hi, once again, thank you for the raid. Really appreciate it. Today, right, we're going to be talking about the domestic violence laws in Britain, in the UK specifically. We're going to be talking about what they are, how they've changed, or the proposed changes being made. We're going to talk about whether or not this is actually an attack on men. Is this something that people should be concerned about when it comes to privacy issues? Is this something that is just? Will it fix the problem? We're going to find out. And I brought a team together to discuss this. So thank you again for being here. Thank you to all my guests. And apologies if, well, Flowtrace is having camera issues. He'll be back. But apologies if I'm a little low energy today. Again, yesterday was a thing. I'm still recovering, so keep that in mind. But for those of you watching on YouTube, hit that like and subscribe button. And for those of you watching on Twitch, give me subs. Give me bits. That'd be great. Really appreciate it. Really help me out. And with that, we will start this show. And we will start with 𝕵𝖎𝖎. 𝕵𝖎𝖎, please give us your thoughts on this.
Hi, yeah. So for this discussion, there's the initial changes to the coercive and controlling behavior laws, which has sparked this discussion. I think they're patently absurd, but that's just the tip of the iceberg. For the audience or anyone who might not know, the British government changed its sentencing guidelines for controlling and coercive behavior to be equivalent, under the eyes of the law, to physical violence, and you'll be charged accordingly. In the context of the announcement, I think it's clear that this is targeting men, is a reaction to certain red pill figures, and will have a disproportionate effect on men. Actually, it already has. But that's just a tiny part of the issue. It's unequivocal that the government, both in the UK and the US, see domestic violence as an explicitly gendered issue. They are wrong. They ignore the fact that at least 1 in 3 victims of domestic abuse are men, and 28% of domestic homicides are men. The government's response to support male victims is grossly negligent at worst and is misandrist and murderous. Grossly negligent at best and misandrist and murderous at worst. I think it's clear as day to me that the government privileges female experiences and victimization above that of men. If you care about victims of domestic abuse, you need to become a loud and vocal supporter of male victims and an opponent of the government's current stance.
Okay, well, strong start. We'll see where it goes from here. We're going to go to Katie next. Katie, what do you think?
Okay, you can hear me, right?
We can hear you.
Okay, good. I think that was very silly, what I just heard. Fact of the matter is, there is a really big issue, especially with women being hurt on a large scale. So over the span of the last 10 years, there's been one murdered woman by her partner a week. So it is a gendered issue and it isn't. Fact of the matter is, rules that are protecting women from domestic abusers, they are not hurting us advocating for men who are being abused as well. These things aren't mutually exclusive and they don't have to be. All these laws are doing is just trying to create stronger enforcement. And yeah, that's what I have to say.
Excellent. Well, thank you for that. We'll get into it in the open. Next up, first-time guest on my show, the Masked Crusader herself, Hannah Thing. Go ahead, Hannah.
Well, this space cyborg goes by Hana Thing, but easy mistake. I totally understand. In a society where we have rules and conditions, we expect everybody to participate and engage in those rules equally. And under this schemata, rights are not a given. So if someone does not wish to engage in the rules and the laws as they exist, then they should be expected to experience diminished freedoms within that, as long as they are proportionate to the crimes that are subjugated upon other people. And in fact, I would say that this is pretty similar to what you would expect for a child who does, a little bit of a of a mistake, that you give them a grounding in a lot of these cases. And in fact, I would argue that I do agree that this rule is sexist, but in that it does not account for.
Uh-oh.
You cut out.
Cut out. We can no longer hear you.
Did I?
Hannah.
Oh, sorry.
Now we can.
I would say that this law, in the posing of this question by Wick to our panel here, is in fact misandrous in itself, that he does not consider women strong enough in order to be perpetrators of domestic violence as well.
Okay, well, that's shots fired. But to be clear, I did not bring this topic. This was brought by 𝕵𝖎𝖎 who disappeared. Hopefully he comes back, because he was the one that wanted to have this panel. So hopefully he's here to defend himself. But if he does not, I will have to take up the charge. I don't want to, but I will.
Oh, no.
Next up, we have first-time guest, another first-time guest on my show, 𝕵𝖎𝖎. Please, 𝕵𝖎𝖎, what are your thoughts here?
I think that, at least from things that I've seen, the laws have some kind of they're just not the way to handle an issue like this, as well as some of the rhetoric surrounding the pushing of the laws seems to be a little bit strange. Just like odd caveats added to statements to make it feel a little bit like swayed one way. Like doing things that kind of make the categories that we're talking about unnecessarily specific, to the point where they're no longer accurate and they don't convey what we're trying to convey. So I guess that's like the big criticism that I have. But yeah, I'm sorry about being late. I'm an idiot.
No, that's fine. If we can see you, if you can turn on your camera, that's great. I'm trying to get 𝕵𝖎𝖎 back in here, so
I'll try.
excuse me, gang. There's a lot going on all at once. Everything all at once. It happens, but we'll get to it. Okay, well, thank you for being here, 𝕵𝖎𝖎. Really appreciate you, and yeah, we'll see how it goes. Next up, we have another first-time guest on my show, Synth. Please, go ahead.
How's it going? Yeah. So I think I mostly agree with what 𝕵𝖎𝖎 just said there. I think that in the terms of the text of the law itself, I don't think that's where the issue lies in terms of anything gender related. I think that the text of the law itself, the issues there just end up being the fact that this law leans overly into like a punitive sort of a desert ethics kind of approach to legality. I think desert ethics is totally and wholly nonsense. And in terms of the presentation of the law, that's where I think most of the misandry lies. I think the misandry lies in the presentation of the law, because I think what happens when you present domestic violence as a women and children issue is you completely ignore the fact that there's already a massive downplaying of domestic violence towards men. And I think when they feel like they've been the victims of domestic violence, they kind of think that they're supposed to suppress that, to not come out, to not talk about that. And if you present a law like this, a domestic violence law, as though it's specifically going to be doing something for women and girls, and don't mention the fact that this does something for all people, I think that ends up furthering a lot of bad precedents already set in our society. But primarily in terms of the text of the law, the issue just ends up being that desert ethics thing.
Okay, well, thank you for being here, and we'll get into it in the open and see how this goes. Last but certainly not least, no stranger to my show, but the first time I've actually seen his face. 𝕼𝖎𝖎𝖏, the drama llama himself, is here in the flesh. So go ahead, 𝕼𝖎𝖏. What are your thoughts here?
Thank you, Wick. Happy to be here. I think that this law is not perfect. It's not the best, but is far from, I think, the badness that is being set out here. I think that this law is generally a good step in the right direction, and of the 8 or so points that were laid out about this law, I think there's only a couple that you can take some moderate issue with. I think the reality is domestic abuse does primarily affect women and children, and that we can acknowledge that while still acknowledging that it does also happen to affect men. Those are perfectly compatible. If there's some criticism of Rishi Sunak's specific verbiage or dialogue on this, then that's fair. But if you actually dig into the laws and the codes, they're quite clear in the UK that this is an issue that affects all people, including men. It just happens to disproportionately affect women, and that's fine to acknowledge.
All right, and with that, let's get into it. If you have trouble getting a word in edgewise, please raise your hand. If I tell you to shut up, please shut up. It's not because I don't want to hear what you have to say. It's because no one can hear people when they're all screaming over each other. But with that, let's go. What do we think, gang? Let's open it up.
Yeah, I want to respond to misunderstanding. I didn't hear Hannah things opening because I got kicked out. I don't know what happened, but I want to respond to misunderstanding. Do not fucking gaslight me. Seriously. This is not a gendered issue. Do not tell me that the Violence Against Women Act, both in the US and the UK, is set there for both men and women. It is not. At every level, legislative, policing, and especially funding, this almost exclusively, is set to protect women. Absolutely. Do not gaslight me.
Okay.
Could I maybe ask a question to
Can
get the panel started? Really, sorry for interrupting, right? But I want to ask one question that might maybe get us to have an idea
Oh, I wanna
where both
respond.
sides are coming. That will, yeah, I thought that was directed at Hannah. It was directed at you both of you, right? Kind of both of you, right?
I didn't
I
hear
wanna
what
say
Hannah
one thing, I
thing
wanna
said
ask a
exactly.
question.
For the question, I
Can I
would
ask one
appreciate
thing really
for the
quick?
question to be asked. Yes, let's move on
Yeah.
with that.
I want to ask one question super fast, which is just that if this bill was called, so if like there was a bill about suicide and it was called like the White Men's Protection Act, we'd all probably have an issue with that, even though it's disproportionate towards white men, right? Like, see, if somebody says suicide was a white men's issue, that would be kind of like a problem.
No,
I
not
agree.
necessarily.
Yeah, if I were to make like a law and like legislate things and be like, oh yeah, we're making this law because to help white men, it kind of like you could just say like help people who struggle with suicidal ideation. Like it just seems like a less specific category. Like we're for some reason adding that in. Like you're adding
If
a
we had
caveat that's not accurate. Like normally whenever we caveat language is to make it more precise, not less.
If we had a city in which 50% of the people were white, 50% people were black, right? And the black people just went on a mad one, right? And started committing violent crime against everyone, but it was just somehow, for some reason, the victims were 60% white. Would you support the mayor or the person in control of that city putting forth propositions saying that this is violence to protect white people, to protect White People Act? Would you support that?
Probably. You could present me, I think,
you would support the funding being absolutely disproportionately in favor of white people instead of the black victims of those crimes, given that black people are what, 40% victims of those crimes.
Potentially. Look, there are definitely going to be ways in which you could present me this that I wouldn't agree with it. But I think the core of the question you're asking is it okay to name a law or have a law disproportionately directed to a group that is disproportionately the victims of the thing it's trying to address? Then I think yes. I think the reason you don't see this about white men is because we live in a certain kind of culture and a certain kind of society. But I don't think there's anything wrong with that.
I'm not saying that the law is it in principle wrong to have laws and protections that specifically target segments of your demographic. I'm not saying that. I'm saying in this particular case, for domestic abuse, in which roughly 40% of the victims are men, this should not be the case. That's my proposal.
I want to give because both Hannah and Katie were called out and didn't get a chance to respond. I want to give them some space here, and starting with Katie, to kind of answer the charges brought against you.
Yeah, so I was actually gonna jump in first and say that I was a bit distracted when I was giving my opening speech and talk about my issues that I have with the verbiage of the law, even though Flow Trace and Synth like brought up those really good points. There are some issues with control elements that we can talk about, which is not gendered issue. It's just about like enforcement of law and implementation of it. And the fact that the law was marketed as helping women and children, and it is true that the law specifically elevates the fight for women and girls to like a national threat level. So I do agree with you that is absolutely gendered in that case. I also agree with you that absolutely men suffer from domestic abuse as well. What I disagree with you is the fact that whether you like it or not, women experience harsher, tougher levels of domestic abuse to the point of murder, which is a different rate to the murder of men from domestic abuse. So we can say two demographics are suffering from this issue, one more than the other, and then we can say also the demographic that suffers from this issue more also suffers from it disproportionately, like severity-wise, more. So it's not unreasonable to say, hey, maybe if we have one woman a week being murdered for the past 10 years, maybe we should do specific laws to make sure that doesn't happen. That's not unreasonable.
It's not unreasonable, no. I never said that women don't suffer domestic violence at higher rates. But what I do think is unreasonable is the amount of support and lip service that women get in light of the statistics that we have in front of us. I'll tell you something.
Just real quick, 𝕵𝖔𝖎𝖙.
Hang on.
Okay, I'd be happy to spit through some facts if you want to just show just the chasm between what men get in the UK.
After you spit your facts, I want to let Hannah in. But spit your facts quickly.
Can I ask my question? Can I ask my question just before
you could go for
it?
Carry on.
What do you mean by lip service?
Well, the lip service is literally right there in the name of the fucking bill. Violence against women and girls. Do you know men get a footnote in the entire document, violence against women and girls, which is purportedly meant to be for both men and women. Men get a footnote. They get a word. I've read the document. It literally says, Priti Patel says, and a final word on men, and like a couple sentences. That's the lip service. That's what men get in comparison to what women get when we know that 1 in 3 victims are men. Do you
Just to
really
be
think
clear,
that's proportional? That's what I'm talking about. That's my issue.
If I can just respond specifically to the footnote question, I've read through the prosecutor guidance for the violence against women and girls strategy, and right at the very beginning, it clearly lies out that while there are gendered patterns and dynamics involved that are more affecting of women and girls, that the laws are gender neutral and all victims should receive the same access, protection, and legal redress.
Yeah, but
I don't think it's fair to say that that's a footnote.
This is gaslighting. That's exactly what I mean. Men get a word. There's a word or two thrown in there for men, but it's explicitly clear that this is
gaslighting if you see a title and you can't read past the title. Okay, that's not gaslighting. That's just you hyperfixating on a title instead of.
I'm not hyperfixating. Have you read the bill? I'll tell you something. Do you know what funding men get in the UK? What male victims of domestic violence get? Shall I tell you what they get? They get about 200,000 for their own hotline, right, for domestic abuse, because the national hotline does not help men. If you're a man and you call the domestic hotline, the national domestic hotline for domestic violence, they'll shove you off to somewhere else, because men do not have, the national domestic hotline does not help men. Men get about £200,000 worth of funding, right, for their for specifically targeting men. Migrants, right? Migrant women, sufferers of domestic violence, get 1.2 million. That's 8 times more for migrant women than 1 in 3 sufferers of domestic violence in the UK. Women who have been accused, prosecuted. No. I've got to get this out. Women who, I've got to get this out. Women who are on trial accused of domestic violence against their partner get £2 million worth of funding specifically for them to cater for their complex needs, according to the government. Women on trial for domestic violence against men get 12 times the funding the entire male population in the UK get. And you're really telling me this is proportional?
Okay. We got to let other people in.
I would argue that the number that you really should be considering is not the total fund amount, but the amount that goes to each victim, a per capita number. And once you can provide that,
do you want me to do the per capita? We can do it right now. This is not going to help you.
I'm going to mute you for now because we got to let her finish her statement before we go in. So Hannah, finish what you have to say, and then other people can get in. But you got to let her finish. Go ahead.
I would argue that in a lot of these cases where we see large national funds that seem very disproportionate, they are considering per capita. They're not seeing like, oh, we have $500,000 for this and then $500,000 for this exact same fund geared towards a different demographic. They're looking at the per capita need. They're seeing that there's a higher need for women and migrant women that need this funding over men. And I'm not going to deny that men are not victims of domestic abuse. I did look up the numbers. At the end of the year, March 2022, in the UK, 6.9% of women experienced domestic abuse, while 3% of men experienced domestic abuse after the 16 into adulthood. So that's yes, I do agree. 3% is not 1 in 3. 3%.
No, but women experience 6% and men experience 3%. That's 1 in 3. The ratio is 1 in 3.
That's the exact same as the inverted ratios of suicide. When 1 in 3 suicides are women, right? But if there was like a men's suicide protection bill or a white men's suicide protection bill, I would hope that every single person on this panel with no exceptions have an issue with that.
No, I would have
someone please find me the total number of female victims, the total number of male victims, and divide the amount of fundings that women get versus men get. Please, someone do that.
I feel like I kind of feel like the Hannah person or Hannah is kind of shifting the burden of like the claim here, right? It's like we have the data that it seems to be 1 in 3 men tend to be victims of domestic abuse. That means like you'd expect to, even if like immigrant women were the entirety of women, you'd expect there to be a much more proportionate ratio. So if you're taking a look at per capita, the numbers have already been provided for you, and it isn't per capita. If you think that they have like some kind of specific need that you need to like reference to, then like I'd expect some kind of like substantiation of that. I don't think it's on the other person to substantiate the idea that they don't have this increased burden.
It's a more complex question than just the per capita funding, because it's what Katie gets to is not all domestic abuse is the same. All of it is clearly bad, but there's degrees, and there absolutely does seem to be a prevalence of stronger or more severe forms of domestic abuse being suffered by women, because they tend to be much more physically inferior.
What this bill primarily targets isn't going to be a change to how we react to things like a murder of a spouse, because in the case of murder of a spouse, it's already an extremely rare crime. Even among the people who it's like disproportionate among, it's still a very small crime. What's targeted by the bill here is going to be controlling and coercive behavior primarily, because that's
controlling coercive behavior. Controlling coercive behavior is going to be dependent upon physical threat a lot of time. In fact, the prosecution guidelines that the UK sets out for these kinds of crimes, it absolutely does. And specifically, the law also, it absolutely does. We can get into that. And also specifically, the law mentions that this is that some of these preventative measures are to prevent those extreme cases of violence. So again, even if it's not in reaction, if it's still in relation to those kinds of more severe violent crimes that women do more disproportionately experience, it would make sense that this would be more disproportionate to women.
No, wait, hold on. Please, let me correct that, because he's just blatantly wrong. Okay, so I'll read this out. I knew we were going to get into this. So it's coercive behavior is meant to have a serious effect upon the victim. That's when it's considered a crime. Now, a serious effect is defined as A, it causes a person to fear, at least on two occasions
that violence will be used against them.
Or, you're forgetting the or bit here, causes B, serious alarm or distress, in which has substantial or adverse effect on B's
that still flows to my side.
Issues.
With violence,
no, it does not. That is not violence.
Does.
If you're a woman and you claim I've been under distress,
hey, stop! Both of you, stop. One at a time. Finish your statement, 𝕵𝖔𝖎. Flowtrace, you can explain how he's wrong, and then Katie has to go. Go ahead.
Please tell me how serious alarm or distress necessitates physical fear of physical violence. It doesn't, because the government has clearly delineated between the two.
If the serious effect relies on either A, violence, or B, substantial adverse effect on their day-to-day activities, then that means that half of the cases are probably going to be dealing with violence, and that's going to be disproportionately focusing on women.
Half of the cases? If there
are, I'm not saying in terms of the actual, I'm not saying it's a 50-50 split statistically. What I'm saying is that if we have three factors, then let me clarify. If there are three factors, and two of these factors are neutral to men and women, and one of them is biased towards women, then that is still going to be a net bias to women, even though it's not as strong as if all the factors were a net bias to women. So
that's
even though violence,
that's just
what you're talking about, man.
No, that is how it works. Violence is going to be something that
work. That's not how the English language works. You can't say that because of the fact there's an or statement. There must be like if there's three criteria, three sufficient criteria, that is going to be evenly distributed among the three criteria. That's not going to be true. That's not going to be true for most things.
Even if it isn't, I'm not making an argument about whether or not they're evenly distributed. What I'm saying is that we can point to ways in which this does disproportionately affect women in the standards, even though they're not all the standards. So it makes sense that there would be a disproportionate focus on women, even if it is the case that disproportionate effect is only affecting one variable, and that variable is much smaller than the other variables. The question is whether or not that's substantial. And if you're making the argument that there is no substantial difference because the amount of times that this coercive controlling behavior relies on violence is almost none, then I think that is quite ridiculous.
Yeah, so there's just like wildly... Oh, sorry, go ahead, Katie.
Katie, then Synth, after Katie goes.
I want to make one thing clear and then make my point. So I will be arguing the things that I'm arguing, but you guys need to understand that I think that domestic abuse towards men is bad. I think there should be more...
Hard disagree.
Do you support changing the name of the law?
Okay, you gotta let her get it out. You gotta let her get it out, and then you can disagree with her. And I'm curious why you disagree. I am curious why you disagree that she doesn't think. And we'll get to that, but I need her to get it out.
The proposition, not that she thinks so.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. I think there should be more funding. I think we don't understand the way women perpetuate domestic abuse towards men. I think there's a lot of stigma towards men coming forward. I will not hear this bull crap about how me and probably Hannah don't care about domestic abuse towards men. That's not the issue here. What I'm talking about is the way that domestic abuse is disproportionately more creates more severe harm towards women, okay? And that is my explanation to why there's a disproportionate amount of funding and why we treat it differently. It is why the law is named towards women and girls, because women and girls are more likely to be murdered or severely beaten in a way that men who suffer unjustified bad domestic abuse will simply most likely not have to experience. That is why it is treated differently.
I'm not
Correct?
saying, listen, I'm not saying that it shouldn't be treated differently. I think that funding and support should be proportional. And yes, you're right. Women do experience domestic violence at higher rates than men do. However, it's still not proportional. The amount of funding and support that women get far, far, far outweighs the per capita crimes that is
When
committed
you're
upon them.
Okay.
That's my
When
point.
you're asking for proportionality, what you're saying is, well, if it's 1 out of 3 men that experience domestic abuse, then the funding should be equivalent to that, like a third of the funding. Are you not
No,
saying
not
that?
necessarily. No, not necessarily. It's not that
Okay,
simple.
good.
There are nuances. Yes, men experience men suffer 1 in 3 1 in 3 instances of domestic violence. But we also need to factor into account that women also experience far higher rates of grievous bodily harm and homicide in domestic violence. I'm not saying necessarily that the funding should be 1 in 3, but the funding as it is right now is almost non-existent for men.
Okay.
It's callous. The way that okay, sorry.
Yeah, no, it's okay. We just need to get other people in here. I know it's everyone wants to speak, and that's great.
Wait, just
but...
one sentence. Yes, I agree with you. We should give more funding to men. That should not be by taking away funding from women. That's just giving more funding generally.
I know Synth wanted in here, so go ahead, Synth.
Yeah, absolutely. So when it comes to like domestic abuse broadly, it's not the case that we can go ahead and this is calling back a bit, but it's not the case that we can just use there are 3 sufficient conditions and assume the distribution will be even relatively equal between those, because certain kinds of crimes are way more likely to be committed than other kinds of crimes. Very extreme violent crimes, like for example, murder, are very rare in comparison to things that are a lot more common, like for example, threats, or like things that are between those 2 extremes. You have things like assault. Right? It's not the case that we could just use the fact these are a list of sufficient conditions and assume they're going to be equal or even remotely equal distributions between them. But when it comes to the core of the issue here, right? Like I know that Flow Trace, you said you'd be okay with it, but I don't think I ever heard 𝕬𝖎 or Katie give an answer to this question, which is if the law was called White Men's Suicide Bill and there was a bill about suicide, I think both of you would, at least I would hope, would have an issue with that. Is that not true? Would you not have an issue with that?
No, I would not. I absolutely would not.
Katie, would you?
I suppose what we should...
Really quick, I want to get an answer from Katie.
Yeah, you go for it.
Would have an issue with that. You know
Thank
what?
you.
But
Holy shit.
I'll say 2 things to this. First, I don't mind changing the name of this bill, but you have to recognize that the reason why it's named that way, it's because it's specifically targeting the homicide and severe bodily harm epidemic that is hurting women.
Are you sure about that? Where are you getting that from? Do you have any evidence to suggest that?
From the article that we fucking read. From the article that we were fucking sent.
What does it say about specifically about the violence and grievous bodily harm and homicide? I never saw anything about that.
I'm glad that we brought this up because this relates to the point that Flow Trace was discussing with Synth. So, in terms of domestic abuse, there are patterns that lead to eventual homicide. Okay, the reason why the control and the coercion enters the bill is because domestic abuse that ends in homicide starts with control and coercion. It gets gradually worse. There are recognizable psychological and psychiatric patterns that we know that happen. That's why they're targeting coercion and control, because we know that's the early markers of something that in the future is very likely to turn a lot more violent and potentially homicidal. That is why it's that way. So, when you're targeting these early stages, it is prevention of the tougher moments ahead. That is the point.
Funk, you've been wanting in, and I understand you're frustrated, right? It's a lot of people.
I guess when it comes to me and Synth both have pretty similar ethical systems, so I understand we'll probably agree on this. But I guess what we could get into is like why we would think that that's like a bad way of like naming the bill or a bad way of going about rhetoric about it. I guess we could dig deeper into that. But if they want to have this conversation beforehand, it's like I'm like totally fine with that.
Fair enough. 𝕬𝖎, you also had your hand up.
Yeah, I wanted to add on the point that Katie was making.
Oh, and just real quick, Flow Trace, if you're speaking to us, no one can hear you. So.
I understand. Sorry, I was talking to chat.
𝕬𝖎, go ahead.
Yeah, I wanted to add on to what Katie was saying in that this bill does very handedly target patterns of behavior, in that it was targeting, violent crimes and people who have been sentenced with 12 months or parole to be entered into specific programs. like the tagging system and then also the behavioral programs. So again, it's not targeting any specific thing. It's looking at those patterns of behavior. It's being more proactive than reactive to solving the problem of domestic murders.
To be fair to the boys who are angry at the bill, but maybe I will say that it sounds like you guys are not necessarily angry at the content. You're angry at the name, and we can get into it. The only
I'm a
thing
trans
that
woman.
I'm not just offended by the name. I'm offended by the nature of it, the lack of funding that male victims get.
Yes, we'll talk about that just very quickly. I'm trying to make a point for you. In the bill, it does say, however, that they do want to develop a certain evaluation tool to preemptively try to address domestic offenders without convictions. And before I support that, I would need to know exactly what the checklist that is given to the authorities is, because if it's just like this guy screamed in public, that's not going to fly for me. But there are other markers, like if it's went through a psychologist and psychiatrist, I don't see an issue with that. It's the same way that you pull someone over and then you see their pupils are dilated and you might give them an owl check. That just makes sense. So I'll have to know about that tool. Everything else about that law refers to convicted felons and perpetrators. This is not an issue.
Can I ask a question, Wick? 3 quick questions, yes or no.
Go for it.
To 𝕬𝖎 and to misunderstanding. So, do you support changing the name?
What's my fucking name? Wick. What the fuck?
Sorry, that was a joke I did earlier, but I will put it back. That's Katie, to be clear.
Katie, yeah. Do you support changing the name to be more inclusive of male victims?
I think it should be more gender neutral, yes.
Okay, so you do.
I agree. That was one of my major qualms when I was reading it, was I didn't like how gender exclusive it was.
Okay, cool. Do you support more proportional funding for victims?
Define
I
more.
would have to better understand what the higher rates of violence are that women and girls face in proportion to men. Maybe I cannot assess from the current information available to me if the funding is sufficient or not.
Okay, we'll have to get into the weeds on that. But in principle, do you support proportional funding for violence against men and in domestic violence cases? In principle, do you?
I mean,
should be an easy yes.
Well, I mean, obviously yes, but you're trying to get me in a gotcha, and I'm
not. I'm just
aware of
simply
that.
asking you.
And I'm not saying, because again, to reiterate, as Katie has said, I've always felt that domestic violence in all cases is abhorrent, regardless of who the victim is.
Okay, cool. Do you support men having access to the... Wait, hold on. Last one. I promise.
No, but this relates to your question, so it's fair that I'd ask you. Okay, if sure. instead of proportional funding, I would say, do you support targeted funding to specifically resolve the issues of domestic violence for men? Would you agree with that? Because that's what I want.
Well, that's the same thing, isn't it?
Okay, if it's the same thing to you, then I support proportional.
So there's two routes you could go down. You could
dropping funding to 0 for everybody.
There's 2 routes you could go down. You could go a route of like specifically gendered funding, like this fund is specifically for women, this fund is specifically for men, or you could just have a gender neutral pot of funding that goes to help survivors of domestic abuse, regardless of their gender, and you could do it that way. All right.
Are you offering that as a legitimate strategy? Would that be what you're supporting?
That's what I would support. I would support gender neutral funding for both male and female victims, so long as the support and funding is proportional, which currently it isn't. That's my contention.
Yeah, I don't think it's the best way to address domestic abuse for men or women.
Let's stop.
Okay, wait, last one, wait, easy yes or no?
No, before we go into that.
But he had a question.
I understand he has a question, but we're going to be talking about this issue. Fine, easy yes, easy no, but then we go back to this issue because I want to dig down with the panel on this specifically, the gender neutral thing. Katie seemed to have some issues with it, and I want to figure out what those are and see if others have the same issues. But go ahead with your question.
Do you support men having access to the national hotline for domestic abuse victims in the UK?
Of course.
There we go. So it seems we agree.
Yeah.
Okay. So, right. So do you take back your comments I made in my opening statement?
Do you take them back?
You said it was very silly, no? Seems like it's not very silly when you agree with all of my main issues.
Okay, well, let's dig into this. Okay, let's dig into this. Rather than taking shots at each other, right? We can figure out where the problem lies, where the difference lies, and then see if we can't move one way or the other. So he asked a question about in the response in the back and forth, and correct me if I'm misrepresenting this, 𝕵𝖎𝖎, but you said something along the lines of you support a gender-neutral pot of funding, right? That goes towards all domestic victims, regardless of gender. Is that something is that an accurate representation?
Sure. And there can be sorry, carry on.
Fair enough. But Katie, you seem to have some problems with that. Why? Can you elucidate why that it's a bad idea?
I'll use it by using an example. By the way, I'm not saying that it's a bad idea. I'm just saying that as different countries
not
are
optimal.
trying to...
It's not optimal. You would
let me finish, and I'll explain to you what my issue. Okay, thank you. So, different countries are trying to find different ways to handle domestic abuse, and we don't seem to have all the answers. The issue is, and I'll give an example, shelters for domestic abuse victims. Usually shelters are exclusive for women. It's because they want to create a safe space where women who have experienced a lot of violence don't have to interact with men. It's like very acute traumatic situations, and it's a purely woman's space. But there is no funding for men's shelters, which means men have nowhere to go. And now the question is, well, if we go the gender neutral route, now men would have a shelter to go. But the shelters that mostly disproportionately service women, because there are more women to service as well, can't provide the safe space environment that the shelter is meant to do.
Why not?
So,
why does that follow?
Do you know what a safe space is?
I understand what a safe space, but why is, if I built a shelter for men, why would that take away from the shelter for women?
That's not what I said.
She's talking about them being in the same shelters.
I have a
is what I
question.
think she's taking issue with. But
I have a big brain question.
Go ahead, 𝕵𝖎𝖎. Let's hear.
Okay. Let's say like I grew up in the blackest ghetto in America, okay, and there was like violent shelters for people who are like victims of crime in these ghettos. Would you like support them being like racially segregated so I don't have to like interact with any like black people who could potentially harm me? This is not a moment. This is not a moment.
I think this is a bad framing, because I don't think
it's a clear no.
Listen, Buckethead, I'm not asking you. I'm asking the other person. They're the one who proposed this.
Why are you being shitty right now? Like, for what
I'm not
reason?
trying. I just want to get an answer to the question.
It's okay. We're just being a little...
I was a playful insult, okay? I'm sorry, Tin Can. I won't do it again.
Cool. I'm not gonna answer your question.
Oh.
Can I answer it?
I think the answer's simple. The answer's no, right? Like, I think we can all agree the answer's obviously no. We would not be okay with racially segregated shelters for domestic violence or for violence in general. We wouldn't be okay with that.
I think the answer is no, but I think the reason why is there's a breakdown in this analogy. I think, this is probably going to be another source of contention, but I think most people would view a really big difference in the differences between the sexes and genders versus the differences in race. And people would feel a lot differently about treating people on the basis of differences by virtue of gender or sex than they would by treating people on differences by virtue of race.
Yes, well, that's how people currently feel, right? But it might not be the case that's a good thing. It could be the case it's a bad thing.
It is a good thing.
If we go back to the 1910s, people would feel very okay with segregating people based on race. But we have an issue with that, right? We can just because people are okay with something doesn't mean it is okay.
I don't really think that's very responsive to my argument. I'm making the case that...
Stop, like there's 20 of you speaking. Stop, all of you. Stop.
Of the question I proposed.
𝕬𝖎𝖎, 𝕵𝖎𝖎, 𝕵𝖎𝖎, go ahead.
I think you're getting awfully close into race realism with this argument, and I would just exact a little bit of care and nuance if you're going to pursue it.
Oh, I'm an omega race realist, actually.
Well, I want to take...
It's clear what the argument is. There's no way that you can treat this as like a race realism argument, right? There are going to be like people who like have different experiences with different
things as
individuals.
Equivocal, and it's a false equivalency, but you don't even see it. So that's why you don't get how we feel about it.
Wait, hold on. Do we
take Katie's side on this?
Maybe this is the
Stop.
I want to ask a question.
Let's go, and
Thank you,
then
Wick.
maybe you can bridge the gap later, 𝕵𝖎𝖎.
I I think maybe the confusion is that I think that one of like that maybe me and Bunk, and I'm not sure, maybe probably 𝕬𝖎 as well, are interpreting these as gender segregation, which would mean it's something that's not real, and maybe 𝕾𝖍𝖎, 𝖎𝖓, and 𝕾𝖍 trace interpret them as sex segregations instead.
No, not for me at least. I don't know about
Okay.
that.
I think it's very difficult to disentangle gender from sex discrimination when you have a population where the two are going to be in lock and step in most cases. So when we say that when we treat one gender differently, if that gender is coinciding with a certain sex, the vast majority of the time in the population, it's very difficult to disentangle those two. Does that make any sense?
Well, that makes sense, but it doesn't really answer the question, right? 𝕾𝖍𝖎, I
Well,
think answered it, which is
that's
just
why I
no,
think we're treating
right?
it. Well, it just.
Well, but should we treat it that way?
Yes, because that's how.
You think we should treat it as?
I think we should, because we can't disentangle in the first place. We can't only treat it as gender if it's inherently entangled with sex.
Bunk, go ahead. Try again.
The reason I bring up this analogy, okay, is that it doesn't seem what constitutes a safe space, for me at least, is which attributes the given people within that space possess, right? If you have a bad experience of somebody of a specific attribute, that doesn't like no longer make it a safe space, right? Just because people could have these types of views and these types of biases, which I totally acknowledge, right? And they're probably less common than racial biases. We don't have the same moral convictions when it comes to racial biases.
Yeah, but
I think the problem is that for a lot of people, they are race realist when it comes to sex or gender. I think a lot of people, and I think I myself side closer to this, is that when you look at the differences between men and women, we view those in a way that is more analogous,
but
with
it's
inherent
mistaken,
differences.
right?
No, I don't think so. I think that a lot of the differences.
I don't think that. Wait, hold on, real quick. I think there's the difference.
So let me explain out of my whole worldview. Please, just let me provide my justification. I provided the statement, but just let me explain. I think there are a lot of differences between men and women that do come from the biological differences between men and women, and that isn't the true for the differences between white and black people. So I think, in a sense, treating these traits as being more endemic to the sex is actually realistic, and that isn't the case for race. So that's all I mean to say when I say I'm a race realist on sex. That's all.
So okay, I want to jump in.
No, wait, what the fuck?
Bunk, 𝕬𝖎, you got a lot of time in the beginning.
I'm so cocked right now. I don't even get it. Okay,
Bunk, I'm giving you time. We let 𝕬𝖎, he had a lot of time in the beginning. We're gonna go Bunk, but I want to give 𝖎𝖓 and 𝕾𝖍𝖎 also a chance to jump in because they're dying to. You can't see it on her tin can face, but you know I can.
All right, I'm glad that insult stuck. So when it comes to I think this might be the difference. When it comes to these types of spaces, I don't think what will happen whenever you introduce like non-segregation in these spaces, that you'll just see like the men beating the fuck out of the women. Okay, I don't think that's what's gonna happen. I don't think that you see like that like happening in men's only spaces. I don't know like if you think there's like some specific genome that's like gonna cause these men to like go savage and start beating the fuck and like killing all the women in there. I don't think it's gonna be like a really large problem. I think if that's gonna be the difference, you could say like I'm a realist about certain differences between the sexes, but that's not gonna be morally relevant here.
Awesome. So I'm so happy you brought that up. You see, because when I call it a safe space, I don't mean that I'm worried that the men who are coming there because they're getting away from their abuser are going to beat up the women.
My turn.
Well, I know that's not what you. I know that's not what you mean. And that's the point of the analogy.
Okay, I want to give 𝖎𝖓 a chance. 𝖎𝖓, step in. 𝖎𝖓, go ahead.
We recognize patterns of abuse within households, correct? That children who are abused often become perpetrators of abuse themselves. So it's not unfair to think that a person who has experienced domestic abuse may become a perpetrator of domestic abuse themselves later on. So I can totally understand and recognize and sympathize with the want of a woman who has been domestically abused to maybe not be near men while she is in the the very fresh trauma of her. Hang on, don't interrupt me, please. I have not gotten to speak very much, and I would appreciate just a couple moments.
Please go. Spit it out, please.
I would be able to sympathize with a victim of abuse, whether they be male or female, to not want to be near the gender of the person, the same gender of a person that just abused them.
So again, this is literally you brought up a statistic of like there might be some kind of correlation between somebody being a previous violent domestic abuse victim and like a future perpetrator of domestic abuse, but that would go hand in hand with everybody else around you.
That is a proven statistic.
It doesn't matter because everybody in these spaces are all victims of domestic abuse.
Finish your thought, 𝖎𝖓, and then we can move on.
Me. I didn't make my point yet.
Generational trauma is a proven thing, and I will allow Katie to speak now.
Oh, well, thank you for
like,
everyone.
that was a
Stop real quick.
two-part
No one
rebuttal.
gets to allow anyone to speak but me. But yes, Katie, go ahead.
Holy shit, bro.
Go ahead. Okay.
You're gonna get it.
I'm going. So Flo Trace betrayed me with his sex realism, and while Hannah is based, my take is a bit different. Okay, and I started by saying this. We are not sure what the best forward is. Personally, if you ask me for my personal preferences, I'm not a fan of safe spaces. However, I am not a licensed clinical psychologist, a psychiatrist, or a person that has any degree or education on this. So, there's a reason we deploy safe spaces. It's not because we're worried that someone is going to weasel in there and beat up all the abused women. It's because psychologists and people who treat those acute cases of trauma think it would be best for the victims to not encounter certain stimuli. Okay, you can say that's racist or that's gender exclusionary. That's great, and we can discuss whether choosing different treatment models is preferable to society. That's a good, respectful sigh right there. Very good, very non-passive aggressive.
My god, holy shit. Everything I do is like a microaggression, okay? Somebody has to flip out at be starting a word or I sigh too wrong.
Come on, we're all friends here. Come on.
I can't do anything right. I'm gonna have to go off screen whenever they it kind of sounds like I do because you just complained about me sighing. I breathed the wrong way and you're upset about it. You don't have to stop your entire rebuttal because you didn't like the way that I sighed.
Are you done? Okay, so what I'm saying...
Finish, Katie. Stop falling for his traps. Katie, just finish your statement.
What the fuck do I do?
So yeah, basically,
for this person.
I'm all up for alternative treatment options. As I currently know, safe spaces is how we treat victims. We either you guys give me a better treatment model outside that incorporates gender neutral shelters, or we just do shelter for men. But there's no funding for that.
Okay, I want
the part with
Bunk, you can respond, but after you respond, no, I'm letting you respond. I'm just trying to clarify who it comes next, so we don't get chaos. 𝕵𝖎 wants to clarify a few things. So Bunk, finish your thought.
So when you say things like, I can sympathize with somebody who has experience of domestic violence and not being able to be around those people, I'm specifically talking to the Hannah thing person. That also seems like the Katie person also agrees with that to some degree. I could sympathize with people having certain biases against people who have shared attributes of those who have they've had previously bad experience with in the past. But you could also imagine that for people have racial biases, right? Maybe somebody's been fucked up by a bunch of black people, and now they've got this wild bias against them. That's why I bring up the analogy, and that's why there's no symmetry breaker. We keep going back
Bunk,
to this.
I'm going to stop this right here. Bunk, I have a question for you. Okay.
Yeah.
Do you think that someone who is claustrophobic, that it's wise to put them in small spaces, right? You understand that it's not actually dangerous
I don't think
to them?
that things like I
Sure,
don't think
but
things like
it's-
claustrophobia
just let me
are the
finish.
same as
You
unconscious
understand?
biases against people.
Right? Do you understand that regardless of whether small spaces will actually hurt someone, we can understand that in most cases, no. Well, claustrophobia is a phobia. It's an unreasonable fear in most cases.
When it comes to phobia of people of different demographic groups, though, the best thing for those people usually ends up being exposure therapy, according to the data, at least.
But when it comes to exposure therapy,
that's why
controlled situations, right? And when we talk about the shelters, which are usually for just the aftermath of domestic abuse victims, that maybe, again, I'm not a psychologist, I don't know for sure, but the argument would be that maybe it is important to segregate them from the people who trigger their emotional responses. Whether those emotional
a trans woman who doesn't pass would also trigger their emotional response, right? So should trans women who don't pass not be able to go to women's shelters?
It's a good question. We'll ask it to the panel. What are you thinking?
That's my point. Though there's no symmetry break with these two. Yeah.
I would argue that the abuse that trans women and trans men experience would be entirely unique to a cisgendered person, and that they would potentially want a safe space that is entirely alignment with their being among other trans people. However, I do want to kind of add on to what 𝕵𝖎 was saying, is that these safe spaces are transient spaces. They're temporary housing to address a person.
But that never answered my question at all.
While they are in a moment of acute trauma in response to what has just occurred to them.
But you just didn't answer the question at all.
And then to treat maybe a potential long-lasting irrational fear as rooted in their trauma, they would go through exposure therapy.
So this doesn't answer the question at all, and it's also just like you just said something, which is just a moment, right? I want to address the way that the Hana didn't answer it, right? So the question I asked you wasn't like, do you think that there are like different ways that trans people would want to be treated? I asked you, is it okay if a trans woman who doesn't pass goes into a women's shelter? Right? Is that okay? Are you okay with that? If a trans woman who doesn't look very feminine, like I've been on HRT for a year, right? I don't pass worth a shit. If I was getting domestically abused, if a man was beating the shit out of me or something in a relationship, would I be able to go to a women's shelter? It's yes or no.
I wouldn't know. I'm not the person who is assessing that. But for me personally, I would accept you into that women's shelter. If you identify as a woman and you have been abused by a man and you don't want to be in a men's shelter, then who am I to say that I would deny you an access to a safe space that would benefit you personally?
But the same argument's gonna
treat it.
Go ahead, Bunk. You're gonna say the same thing I'm about to say. But go.
Oh no, I was gonna say like, but if they were abused by a woman, and it's like, okay, get the fuck out, like you can't be here, like what?
No. Because what I am saying is that I would respect the wishes and the wants and the needs of the person who is seeking shelter. So if there is, say, a lesbian woman who is being abused by her female partner and she doesn't want to go to the women's shelter, then I don't think she should be denied access to a safe space that would be more comforting to her while she's experienced her
but I'm going to trigger
trauma before she.
I'm gonna trigger somebody with trauma towards cis men just as much as a cis man would, because I look like one. So your argument for cis men, or your argument for why I should be able to go in there, would also apply to cis men.
This is so reductive.
No, it's not. It's a good question.
Yeah, I think this is a silly discussion.
Okay.
I think it gets to the core.
Well, Flowtrace, I want you to answer it since we're discussing this side. 𝕬🎧, you're in line. Don't worry, I got you, buddy. But Flowtrace, I was pointing at one and said the other. Flowtrace, what do you think? Would you allow a trans woman who does not pass? Do you think that is good practice or best practice to allow them into women's shelters?
I think that it would have to. I think that it has to be on a case-by-case basis, because I think that Synth is absolutely right that it comes down to whether or not that is going to be disruptive to the recovery process for the others. I think the core of this question is not necessarily whether or not it is right or wrong, but is it effective? Because I think that's where whether or not it's right or wrong comes from. I think if we go back to the hypothetical that Bunk asked, which I also think is a fair hypothetical, about if a person was triggered by the presence of African American or a certain ethnic group, would it be appropriate for them to have a safe space? I think that answer potentially could be yes, if it was the case that we had really strong evidence that the only way to address that sort of their trauma was to have a safe space and then have that kind of limited exposure therapy of reintroducing them. Now, as far as I'm aware, and I'm not like a very like super educated person or anything like that, all the best evidence we have right now does point to the fact that these kinds of safe spaces for women are very effective. So given that that is the case, then I do think it is fair to have these kinds of spaces. But I don't know if that would be the case on race. If it would be the case, and if it was really one of the only best methods, then my understanding is that all the clinical studies that have been done on safe spaces for women as a way to address fear or trauma related to just the presence of men from a specific abuse scenario are effective.
What study?
Yeah.
I don't have a study site. It's just,
he's talking hypothetically.
No, I'm saying that.
No, I'm not talking
even
hypothetically.
true.
Can you?
If it's not true, then if this is a general understanding that I have. I don't have a citation on me right now. It was my understanding. If that's wrong, then I would love to see that legitimately.
The point is not to be effective therapy, because it doesn't work as being effective therapy. The point is just to make sure people aren't homeless.
I don't think that I don't think that's quite true. My understanding is even outside of the context of homeless shelters, having safe spaces where you're talking to only members of a like group is effective at sometimes building that rapport and opening up about the situation. A similar strategy employed in alcoholics. A similar strategy, whether or not it is legitimate for victims of domestic abuse to feel like they can't open up around the men. It's not perfectly effective, but this principle, as far as I'm aware, has proven to be effective. If there's evidence to the contrary, I legitimately would love to see that. I'm not trying to claim
the majority of AA people end up relapsing within 30 days after leaving
that's not because we're not talking about AA general. We're talking about the principle of would AA be more or less effective if it was open to anyone or just people that were alcoholic.
Going into AA is I think beyond the scope of this discussion. Let's bring it back.
Us alcoholics? Can anybody
going to AA is beyond the scope, but when it was trans people, you let it. Okay, fine.
When we were talking
because it's well within the scope. It's about
violence.
Wait, can I get in?
Yeah.
Okay,
Wick, can I get in here?
𝕵𝖎𝖎, go ahead.
Yeah, I don't actually think anything Katie said was too outrageous. I actually agree with her. I think so. We can have a discussion on whether it's right to stereotype a particular sex, whether that's a good thing or not, and whether it's morally acceptable. But as 𝕬𝖎 said, it's not necessarily when a woman has been battered and she's like in immediate and acute danger, it's not necessarily the right time to have that discussion. If a woman needs like a space, perhaps for a day or two, a week, whatever, some transient housing to shelter her until she can go on then to calm down, recover, and then go on then to a gender neutral shelter, perhaps. I think that's totally fine. The analogy was made to race. And I think in some cases, it would be okay to have a racially segregated shelter. Let's say, for example, you were a Jew, right, during the Holocaust, and the Nazis were holocausting you. You've just escaped from the concentration camp, right? You might not necessarily want to go to a shelter with Germans there, who are like controlling the shelter. You might want to be like, hey, yo, just like at least for a week or two, like give me some space. I think that's understandable. Yeah, the issue of trans inclusion in here, it does complicate the issue, but I don't think it necessarily has to be like this absolute one or the other, gender neutral or no genders at all, gender neutral or gender segregated. You can have a mix of the two. You could ask the trans individual themselves if they want to go to a gender segregated place, whether they'd be okay with a gender neutral place. I don't think it necessarily has to be a hard line, one or the other.
Okay.
Yeah. I don't doubt that somebody could be like, I want to like stay back from these people, but at least to my knowledge, the what do we call it?
Katie. Just sigh really loudly. Go figure. Carry on, Bung.
Okay. So to my knowledge, right, you see like different biases between individuals of like intrinsic groups. This specifically goes to race. I know this goes to race. I'm not sure how this would apply to other intrinsic characteristics, though I imagine the psychology would apply similarly, that like being around these people tends to be really, really good for the attitudes around the groups in question. While it might not be the case that like somebody who's generally racist would want to be around these people, it could be the thing that's best for them. People can be mistaken about their preferences. Certain people might like think that they want to smoke, but in like reality they shouldn't, right? And we'd all agree that they shouldn't. I don't know. I feel like this is a little bit more complicated than just saying like, I can understand that like somebody would want that, right? It's not about like.
Bonk, I'm so happy you said that, because it directly brings me to where I want to talk to you about. So
cool.
I think J.K. Rowling is a really good example of a person who was traumatized and then chooses to continuously weaponize their trauma in a completely biased, misandrist way that is harmful to trans people, to men, to women. Okay? I'm not talking about women and human beings who haven't processed their trauma properly and then use their trauma to discriminate and be inappropriate with other human beings in a really disgusting way. I'm not talking about that. If you want to talk about generally women who were domestically abused and then have lasting biases against men and want men to be segregated from them under all accounts, sure, we can talk about that thing, but that's not a problem. The specific thing that we're talking about is safe spaces, shelters for women, a very short period of time when a woman is being extracted out of a domestic abuse situation. She doesn't have a house. It's a very troubling time, and it seems that the therapy method is that being around other women and getting specific support to women's issues helps in that case. It's really not that complicated. We're not talking about lasting misandrist effects. We're talking about a period of time where it's a safe space. It's not a racist thing.
I like how you're like condescending the fuck out of me, but you like completely missed the point of everything that I said, right? I'm not talking about there's gonna be some like wild difference between long-term and short-term effects. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm not saying that these people are gonna go out and they're gonna like ask for people to be like discriminated against them in other places as well. I'm talking about this specific thing. People can be mistaken about their preferences. It's like will help them get better in the future. That's what I'm talking about. It was pretty clear, I feel like, to everybody else on the panel. That's what I'm talking about, and I appreciate if you didn't condescend me while missing my point completely.
Okay, I don't know what I did to feel that I'm condescending you. I apologize if you feel like I'm condescending you. I'll try to speak differently. So,
No, it's just like no, it was kind of obvious.
Can I ask Bunk a question?
Okay, that's great.
It should
try
just be a
and- try and
tone.
understand.
No, I'm going to respond. Sorry.
Respond, but then I want to get 𝕵𝖎𝖎 and 𝕵𝖚 to ask Bunk a question too. Go ahead, respond.
So what I'm saying is that the time to try to help these women see men better is, I understand that you think it's more ideologically beneficial to the world that you want. It just seems that psychologists disagree with you, and it's okay that you don't feel like that.
Oh, you said
Okay, but no,
psychologists
but
disagree with me.
I
Can you
don't
say
think- I
something? No,
don't-
shut the fuck up. Can you say something?
Don't tell me to shut the fuck up, bitch.
No, you interrupted me.
No,
It's my
come
turn to
on,
say
you
it.
shut the
I
fuck
will
up.
tell,
Can't
I will
we
tell
be friends?
all of you to shut up. 𝕵𝖎𝖎, ask your question.
What? Wait, what?
Yeah. No, I
Bunk
don't think.
me
No,
with
he's
the fuck-
half. No,
Shut
he's
up.
going. No, listen. He's going on about the reason why I asked the question is because he's going on about do you have studies, etc., to back that up. I want to ask him hypothetically. If hypothetically we did do the studies and it did come back that having gender segregated shelters for specific instances and acute trauma for women had better outcomes in the long run, it had better outcomes for both women and men. Would you still have this hardline ideological stance against them?
Well, I don't have a hardline ideological stance against them. I'm a
So
hardline
you support them?
utilitarian.
Just I know what to say. Then I
No,
Okay,
I'm-
so all right.
yeah,
so
I'm a
if it came
utilitarian.
out,
of course, it had better consequences. What I'm saying
Thank
is, I
you.
have data that seems to show that is not the better consequences. There could be some kind of distinction between the short and the long term. They say psychologists disagree with me. I'm asking which psychologist can you please cite me some? Right, I brought
can
my
you
data
please
to the
cite me?
table.
Can you please cite your psychologist? That's it. Yeah.
Yep, I can get them to you right now. Actually, give me 1 second.
But wait,
Okay,
you don't
well-
have any `𝕬𝖎𝖎 to cite?
Well,
Pardon?
I mean,
in the
You don't
group
have
if
any
you
chat-
wanna
insight.
play the,
No,
if you wanna
because-
know
because
if
my
I get a
question- my
citation game with me,
my-
I'm very good at these.
My
citations.
question was
I have all of them.
entirely hypothetical. If I said if it was the case, I didn't say I had any studies to back up what I was saying. I was just saying if.
Yeah, well, somebody else on the panel who you were interrupting the dialogue between, right, did think that they have like studies to back it up, right?
Yeah.
I know. I don't believe Katie did. She didn't
Katie
provide
says-
anyone.
Well, let's ask. She's here on the panel. We can ask
Yeah,
her.
let's ask Katie.
Katie, do you have any studies to show that women's
Working on it.
shelters...
I'm working on finding the links right
Okay,
now.
please do. While they do that, right, I wanted to get 𝕵𝖎𝖎 in here, and 𝕵𝖎𝖎 allow him to kind of give his 2 cents. Go ahead, 𝕵𝖎𝖎.
Yeah, I feel like we're mostly disagreeing, not in principle, but on a descriptive question. I think there are some people that think that that having gender segregated or sex segregated homeless shelters is very efficacious to the ability of people to get over their trauma, and other people disagree. And I think that if we all became factually aware of one being the case or the other being the case, I think we'd all agree. There's just a disagreement over that descriptive question. The question that I actually kind of wanted to ask is, this is a valuable discussion, I think, is part of the broader picture about men versus women in terms of domestic abuse. But does anybody have any specific spokes of the law that they disagree with? Because to my knowledge, this law doesn't have anything about funding for domestic abuse shelters. And mostly, I was expecting most of the disagreement to be over the nature of promoting stiffer punishments against coercive behavior and the digital predictive tool, which I gotta admit sounds kind of scary, even though I support it. We haven't talked about that at all.
Yeah, so I shot 1 citation.
within
the given.
Yeah, this is a racial study about to do with the
Yeah,
racial
you
exposure. and
asked me about
prejudice.
for the racial studies. Yes,
Yes,
of course.
yes,
Do you really
of
think
course.
this is as typical? Do you
Are you an idiot? Are you actually a moron? Are you sub 70
Do you
IQ?
really think this is a typical?
You're
my
basing
days.
your bullshit on the racial bias and exposure.
That's the claim that I made.
Oh my god! You're
That was the 𝕬𝖎𝖎. Like, I don't understand why this is like we're being all up in arms about this.
I think
Like, of course, that's the data that's going to get
I
provided.
said I have
I'll make
data on
Global
this.
Bridge.
This suggests this thing about other types of indications, like people's outward expression.
Okay, I think
characteristics
Bunk,
about
the reason that
individuals.
they're
It seems
responding
that we
like
would
they
have
are,
evidence-
the reason that they're responding right they are, but because it's like we had. Let me give you an analogy here. It might not be a perfect analogy. It says I claim
God.
that I have. I'm trying to link anorexia and the treatments to anorexia to well, we don't treat anorexics this way. Why would we treat people who are overweight in that way? And then the argument goes and transitions to how we should treat overweight. We talk about that for a while, and then when they you make a claim, they ask you to back it up. You link once again to the anorexia study. What they're trying to do is ask you to link the race elements that you're bringing up and link it to why this matters for gender.
Oh,
right?
I super obviously linked that. These are both going to be things that are intrinsic attributes but given individuals. These are going to be things like we can have biases against people for. Like, of course, it's like super obvious that this would be data that would like raise the real quick. It would be data that would raise the
But in that argument,
Stop. It's data that would raise the probability of the hypothesis that I'm positing versus the hypothesis that you're positing. If this is the only data that we have, and you have no data suggesting what you have, that puts the probability in my favor.
No,
Like,
I just don't think that follows. To be clear, I think that
why not?
This is just like simple
discussing something
Bayesianism. It's going to
different. So
follow.
your
just, like,
study,
super Bayesian
your
reasoning,
study
like,
talks
obvious.
about your study talks about exposure to other people's races increasing the liking of those races, right, over time. But the issue here is we're talking about someone who has acute and specific feelings of harm, or what do you call it, fear of the other race. You need to have a study that purports to support your idea that someone who's experienced say, for example, racism, say, for example,
we can just say trauma.
So,
right?
yeah, say for some trauma, exposure to the other race helps them in that instance. That's what you need to do. Your study does not support this.
No,
We're
it's like
talking about
even
biases
worse.
against
This is so intellectually dishonest.
No,
I mean,
it's
I
not.
don't know
You
if
guys just don't
did this
understand.
on
You guys
purpose. I don't know if you did this
You guys
on purpose
screamed
or
at me
not,
for a
but
source. You guys said
total
source.
exposure-
You have no idea what you were asking me to source. The thing that I told you is that it seems that for other biases about things that are intrinsic attributes for individuals,
What
being
are you
exposed to
trying
those
to
people,
prove?
shut up. Being
What are
exposed
you
to people,
trying to
stop
prove?
talking. Oh my god,
What
I
are
can't
you
interact
trying
with
to
you.
prove?
Stop talking.
What
I'm
are you
trying to
trying to
explain it to you.
prove?
I can't explain it to you if you keep talking.
I'll keep talking over you if you tell me to shut up, you know?
Are you done?
Yes.
Okay, sick. So what this shows is the claim that I made was that it seems to be if biases against individuals with certain intrinsic characteristics being exposed to those individuals, specifically on the topic of race, that's what I claimed that I had data on throughout this conversation. You guys screamed at me source because you didn't know what the fuck I was actually you were asking me to source. And whenever you got the source of that claim, you're flipping the fuck out because you couldn't track the conversation. I think
So
it was
you
super
know
obvious
how-
that everybody else,
Kimberly,
what I claimed is
hold
I
on,
made,
hold
how
on,
this
Kimberly,
correlates to other
we're gonna
types of intrinsic biases against people who have immutable characteristics, and how that could also contribute to other types of biases as well.
Okay,
Once you have
great.
data that distinguishes between these two different types of trauma, this would raise my hypothesis and lower the probability of yours.
Okay, Kimberly, just hold on one second. We got to go to Hannah. She's been trying to get in, and
Did you call me Kimberly?
Look, they paid me $5 to do it, so go ahead. Hannah, go ahead.
I would reject the framing of intrinsic characteristics in regards to race because, again, in a discussion regarding violence and how we respond to acute trauma, you are proposing that some races may be more violent than others, and that really seems to be what that is circling back to.
What?
You are
He's
heavily
not saying
implying
that.
it.
No, he's not saying that because
Oh,
from
yeah.
his perspective,
After
Katie. I think Amber just got to understand. Please, Bunk, please, I think I can help you here. The reason why Katie, or excuse me, sorry, I'm getting the names mixed. The reason why Hannah, you feel that way is because I think you and I, Hannah, I think that the bunk is coming from the perspective that sex and gender are far more mutable and not intrinsic to the characteristics as races, whereas we are not coming from that. So you're yeah, I think that's the difference. But from his perspective, when he's analogizing them, he isn't saying that because he doesn't feel that way about sex or gender.
No, what I'm saying is that there are individuals who could have certain biases against people, even if that's not like a rational fear to have, right? I don't think that that's like a rational fear to have. Like with men in these spaces, they're gonna be like start beating the shit out of women. I think we all seem to agree with that. That's probably not gonna be the case if you incorporate them. But people could have these types of biases due to other types of unfortunate interactions with given individuals who have like who have these immutable characteristics. That's why the data that I cited tends to lean towards the idea that people being exposed to those who have those immutable characteristics can kind of undo those preconceived biases. That seems not only like it seems to be true on the surface of it. I think it's very intuitive for people that if you have preconceived notions about people who have a certain attribute, interacting with people who have that attribute who go against your preconceived notions will probably update the way that you view people with those intrinsic characteristics, but also that we have data that supports the idea that those biases tend to be unwoven.
Okay, Destiny Jr., hold on. I want to kind of give a...
Stealing my title.
Well, again, people pay me to do things, and I do them. Okay, so, I
have to. Please, you let Flo, Trace, and Hannah, and not me. I have a different argument, please!
Katie, we're going to be stuck on this forever, so we can do one of two things. We can be stuck on this forever, or I can get us back to the actual topic. It's up to you.
Let
I'll
her
let
go.
you
Come on.
decide, Katie. Fine. Let's.
You called me
let's-
Kimberly. I deserve
Go
it.
ahead, Katie. Go ahead. Why
Okay.
not? Fuck it.
Destiny Jr. I want to build a bridge here, okay? I'm honestly, because maybe this whole thing have been like a genuine misunderstanding. So I feel like earlier when you told me that I missed your point, and I feel like you're completely not addressing my point, then obviously we're speaking past each other. So I absolutely agree with you. It is correct that there is established research around how exposure to different races would reduce prejudice against them. We both know this. Your study is completely valid. The point that some people on the panel were trying to make is not about, and that's why I asked you, for what purpose are you bringing this data up? Because to me, what I'm trying to say is, look, safe spaces, women's shelters are specifically for a very short period of time. It's not a time to address negative biases, badly formed or unbadly formed. It's just about giving very acute treatment to a problem. And I get you have a valid statement. Do we want to be a society that even in that acute state, we are potentially feeding in to prejudices? Is it fair that because this woman was abused by this one guy, we are now telling her she is safe by not being around men? Okay? And we can have that moral, ethical discussion, but that doesn't change what we were trying to say, that if treatment showed that that was the best option to handle that acute situation, there's nothing wrong with that. Okay, so we're just speaking past each other.
If that was the case, but then you claim that psychologists claimed this, and I asked which psychologist. Give me one. You don't have to have every single psychologist who's ever claimed it on hand. That's fine. But just like one citation, maybe like one study you've read at some point that makes you believe this, because otherwise it kind of sounds like you're making empirical claims out of your ass, and one of us has sources to back up their empirical claims and one of us doesn't.
Okay, so this is where it's annoying, because you think if I'm making empirical sources out of my ass, which I might be, I don't know whatever empirical sources you think you have prove your point. And this is, I guess, where the bridge falls down, because you don't understand data.
No,
which
I do
is
understand
fine.
data. I think the only one who understands data.
Okay,
the
back and forth,
do with
the
data,
back and
is
forth,
we
guys.
extrapolate from it.
We've done this.
Always
We've
do
done
that.
this.
Sometimes
We've
things
run
like,
this
for
circle.
example,
Stop, all of you. Stop,
Okay.
all of you. Stop. We've run this circle. We've run it into the fucking ground, and I wanted to kind of move on to the next topic, right? Which is the original topic that we were supposed to be discussing today. And I'm sure it will go off the rails in a unique and fun way, but it will be a different way, something maybe entertaining to my audience, and we'll see how it goes. So, Flowtrace brought a very good element of this law that I wanted to discuss. Flowtrace, I want to give you to the floor to explain in your own terms, because I believe you're an honest actor here and will do so faithfully.
Big mistake.
Fair enough.
Just
the
kidding.
AI, the digital aspect of this that I personally find concerning, and I think that you said sounds scary. So can you give us a TLDR on that, and then I want to ask 𝕘𝖎 if he thinks this is part of his problem with the law, and we can go ahead.
Yeah, so basically what the law proposes is that it's going to create some sort of predictive digital tool that's going to use information from specifically police reports as a way to try and predict people that are at higher risk of actually committing these sorts of offenses. The problem is that the law is very vague and not specific. There's very little information on what this tool is actually going to look like and how it's going to be applied. I think my greatest defense would just be that we don't yet know enough about this to specifically condemn it, because I think there are very positive implementations. I think it is, it is the kind of thing that you need to be careful about.
Can you give us an example of a positive implementation of this kind of thing?
Yeah, I think that the policing system works off of the biases of individual people, and that we can create machine learning algorithms or any sort of digital tools that are not perfect but are a lot better. It's like, I think like AI cars don't need to be perfect; they just need to be better than the average human driver. And I think the average human driver is quite bad. I think the analogy basically holds the same here. There's a lot of data to sift through that is very difficult for humans to sift through, particularly doing so very judiciously and equally. And I think a digital tool has the potential to be a lot more positive, especially when it comes to the impact of this just being identifying individuals at risk. It's not like, it's not going to be pre-crime. It's not like we're going to identify these people and then arrest them. And that information then being available through I think it was the 8th spoke of this law, through Claire's law, I think that's also a positive.
Yeah, I want to jump in like immediately.
Go ahead.
Could you link that?
Thank you. Really quickly.
I didn't see that bit of the article, to be honest. The digital tool.
Hey.
While
Synth,
you link
real
that,
quick, can I ask one question?
Let's
Is
go
Phoenix
for it.
playing Skyward Sword in the background?
Yes, you're correct.
I got it. Holy
So, yeah, with machine learning, right, there's this big issue, which is that if it's the case that you're training machine learning algorithms, you're training them using a training data set. And the places you get training data sets from is generally you just find them online, right? So there are some that have been pre-filtered and pre-manufactured. Like there are some for like optical character recognition, right? That are all very, very, very refined. But if you have a big training data set, it's just going to I'm not sure what you're saying. I couldn't hear you. But if you have a big training data set, you're just going to retrain people's biases back into whatever this machine learning algorithm is. And we see this in things like facial recognition algorithms, right? For example, it's the case that like me and you, we've seen a lot of people of different groups, but most photographs will be of white people. There's going to be a disproportionality through which photographs are of white people. So when you're training facial recognition algorithms, it actually ends up being pretty bad for people who are black on average. So machine learning algorithms should end up reflecting and sometimes even amplifying the biases that we already have, because you have to train them on training data sets. Those training data sets will, on step one, they have people's biases in them just like innately. And step two is they have people's biases in them systemically, because some people are obviously more likely to be recorded in the data than others.
I agree with what you're saying in principle. I just think when it comes to the application, I don't think it's as bad as what you're saying. There are no doubt implementations of this that would absolutely enhance the biases. But I also think there are hypothetical implementations that could reduce the biases. They'll never escape those biases. Yeah, so there are ways that you can, in fact, let me actually just link a study. I'm going to be honest, I am not the most technically well-read person, so I might be misunderstanding the study. But from what I understand off of the study that I was reading, there have been successful uses of these sorts of tools to go through lots of police data and do it in a way that is more accurate and even-handed, even within the context of the bias, than what it would be if you had humans do it.
What I don't understand, even just from a technical perspective, how we could possibly make sure that we are actually filtering out things that could be biased without just having another person sit there and manually do it. And if you have a person sitting there manually doing like paying people on Mechanical Turk, what you end up having is just you have their biases in the training data set.
Yeah, if someone else wants to get in, I'm going to need to look up at that specific part in the article for you, or the study, sorry.
If I could jump in for just a second, that is an actual career, is to be an AI trainer. And in fact, I have met some of these people that they do kind of scrub the data to help assess for bias and to further guide the AI to be either less biased or more efficient than humans.
Yeah, usually the way that we do this in the industry, we don't actually do it manually with even with Western workers. It's all outsourced to like the third world. So Amazon has a service called Mechanical Turk, right, which is really commonly used for building training data sets. That's because you can have a lot of people work very, very cheaply.
Yeah, I want to get.
I don't think there's a reason to be against this in principle. Like if it works, it works. We need to see what the results are.
Yeah, I'm against it on a technical basis. Not on principle. I just think it's like on a technical basis, there's not a reliable way to implement something like this that won't just have other human beings' biases rebaked back into it on a best case scenario. The worst case scenario is it has.
Are you like a deep learning engineer?
No, I'm just.
Do you have
a
technical basis for reason for? Like...
Yeah, I do.
Okay, sure. Then we'll have to see. We'll have to see what results from.
Yeah, I'm not like an ML engineer or like anybody who works in like machine learning specifically. I've just done machine learning stuff on other projects as a programmer. Right, I'm not like a specialist.
Okay, sure.
Well, as we have been building AI technologies, we've gotten better and better at training them. I know that one incident that happened in recent years was, the AI training with the YouTube algorithm of what is bannable and what is not. And also in regards to like what gets demonetized and not. And that is still a tool that's in progress. But I would think that as we're implementing a tool that is as sensitive as this one and with something that has as such high stakes as this, that they would be very careful in the ways that they would train it. I mean, that would be my assumption.
Being careful alone is not sufficient, right?
To see.
Well, OpenAI is very.
OpenAI is really.
Well, before we can cast judgment on it, right?
That's not even close to true. We actually don't want to try it first and then cast judgment on it later. We want to do it in the opposite order. Otherwise, you have like safety issues. So if you want to take a look at a counterexample,
there would be no advancement at all.
That's not even true. Everyone, not everyone, right? I shouldn't make such a general claim. But the vast majority of AI researchers the AI safety researchers specifically hold the stance I do, that we fix the alignment issues first and then we implement afterwards. We fix things like ELK first and then we implement afterwards.
Well, to be fair,
there's risks. I'm not necessarily talking about AI implementation, but there's risks when you implement any new tool or any new whatever. There are always risks involved. And you have to take those risks and try it, right?
No, sometimes risks are more significant than others.
And you try to mitigate the risk as much as possible before you implement it through testing and trials.
Well, sometimes
do you accept some
domains of implementation?
Do you accept there is a minimum
trials in specific areas or districts?
Do you accept that there is a minimal amount of risk that we can accept, right? Before
yes, absolutely. But this is far beyond that, right? This is like almost guaranteed to have an amplification in biases.
Mate, how can you say that? It's like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5.
Because of the fact that I understand how the training data set process works.
Dude, there are 6 lines. You're judging this based on 6 lines.
I understand
we have no idea how this is going to be implemented.
Are they gonna have a breakthrough in machine learning training?
We don't even know if it is machine learning training. This is machine learning, right? It just says a digital tool.
It would actually be insane if all they did was just do basic stats analysis and didn't do machine learning. That would be even crazier to me.
We don't know. You have no idea.
Hold on. If they did, that would be even worse because it's literally just going to be purely a person's coded biases. It's like if you've seen those stories. You've seen those stories like in children's books where like they ask the genie a question, or they give the genie a wish, and the genie interprets their wish very technically and very literally, and gives them a wish they didn't ask for. Yes. If a computer is far more literal and far more technical than a genie will ever be. It will interpret your words very, very, very literally. It's just like
I'm not saying that there aren't risks involved. I'm not saying that. There could very much potentially be risks involved. You don't know that. What I'm saying is, I'm sorry, but I don't know if I trust your opinion based on fucking 6 lines.
Well, you don't have to trust my. You don't have to trust my opinion based on 6 lines. You can trust and understand. You can go open up Wikipedia and you can research the topic yourself and have at least an entry-level understanding of it. You don't have to trust my expertise. I'm appealing to experts who know more than any of us.
If it is machine learning.
More than me, more than any of us.
Would I be looking at fucking?
If you were looking at non-machine learning, approaches like just actual procedural programming stuff, then it would be an even bigger issue for the reason I just gave you.
Okay, I want to give some other people a chance here. I want to go to Hana, and then I want to go to Flowtrace, and I know Katie wanted in at some point, so go ahead.
I do not care about this whatsoever. It has little to do with the topic. Please don't come to me
agree.
with it.
Okay, well, this might be a brief portion. Go ahead.
Yeah. My final statement on it is we don't know what the scope of the tool actually is. We don't know how they're going to implement it. And I would imagine that before they implement anything nationwide, that they're going to run tests and trials in limited districts and regions. And so without actually seeing what the tool is and understanding what sort of mechanics it is using to measure, then we can't, even begin to discuss or understand what the potential risks may be.
We can induct from other existing machine learning projects. Yeah, we can. Yeah,
they're not going to machine learning, mate.
We don't know, but
Well, I didn't even understand what you just said there, 𝕾𝖍𝖎𝖙.
I said we don't even know if it is machine learning a tool that they're going to use. We have no idea.
We could just take a look at other procedural programming projects.
Tools, machine learning and different.
Machine learning and not machine learning. Yeah, those are the 2 tools. Yeah, machine learning and procedural. Yes.
Okay, you're using the same metrics of saying something is a potato or it's not a potato. Either it is a potato or it's not. Either something is machine learning or it's not. That's not useful in the discussion.
If non-potatoes all exploded and potatoes exploded, you wouldn't want to eat anything anymore.
Are you saying we can never use machine learning or procedural algorithms? I'm not sure what the second one you said is, to help identify crimes.
In policing, it's very dangerous currently. I think if we want to do a lot of investment into that tech before we ever implement anything, I would be fine with that, but we can't do that currently.
Well, that's exactly what this precisely says. It said they're trying to develop it.
Does not have the investment. It does not.
How do you know? You don't know what the investment is, mate. It's 5 lines.
Do you have? Yeah, it doesn't matter what you think. How you can keep saying it's 5 lines over and over again because you have no idea what the fuck you're talking about when it comes to the topic, right? But if you want to go take a look at the
mate, it's 5 lines. How are you basing this on 5 lines? You don't know shit about this.
Machine learning. Do you want to talk to me about who knows more about this topic?
I'm not talking about machine learning. All I'm saying is you don't even know if it is machine learning.
Hey, 𝕾𝖍𝖎𝖙, what's gradient descent?
Oh, really? We're going to
shit about the subject.
Oh, God.
You don't know shit about the
subject.
subject.
Does it have any relevance to these 5 lines? Does it have any... Wait, what did you say? What did you say?
Who could teach you about this topic?
What did you say? What did you say, sorry?
Gradient descent.
Does that have any relevance to these 5 lines?
Yes.
So stop talking out your fucking arse. How does it have any relevance to this? You don't know what tool it is. You have no idea what... You have no idea what tool this is.
You don't know what gradient descent even is, so how would you know if it's relevant? You don't know shit about the subject. You wouldn't know 𝕊𝖽𝑏uzz from your asshole.
That's why I don't comment on it. That's why I don't comment on it.
You are commenting on it. You are doing that currently.
All I'm saying is, we don't know what the tool is. We shouldn't judge.
Stop, or you will be stopped. Okay. I wanted to give Flowtrace a chance. He might know a little bit about this. Just a tad. Flowtrace, why are you for this? It seems like you're for this. And then we'll move on. I promise you, gang, so we can get Katie and the board people in on this.
I think
Go ahead, Flowtrace.
I think that because the use of this tool would be only to identify people as high risk, not to prosecute them, not to charge them. There's sort of a capping on the risk, as Synth puts it. There still is, to be clear, there still is a risk, right? This program could be implemented and it could be horribly bigoted and it only identifies people of a certain ethnic group, and that's unfair. But that is still much better than if, for example, this was used to actually charge people, like true pre-crime. So I think that is my primary argument. And secondly, I am not the most well-read on this subject, so I just would like to put that out there as a bit of a caveat for this. But I did link a study, and I've now been able to go find the specific sections I was referencing earlier. If it's okay with everyone, I'm just going to read these real quick. I've got two. First is from the abstract. Quote, our models made significant improvement upon the predictive capacity of DASH, both for intimate partner violence, IPV, AUC, and other forms of domestic abuse. The most influential variables in the abuse were the categories of criminal history and domestic abuse history, particularly time since the last incident. We showed that the DASH questions contributed almost nothing to the predictive performance. We also provide an overview of model fairness performance for ethnic and socioeconomic subgroups of the data sample. Although there were disparities between ethnic and demographic subgroups, everyone benefited from the increased accuracy of model-based predictions when compared with officer risk predictions.
Yes.
So that seems to be saying...
No, you're misinterpreting the study, right? The study is not saying that it's the case that this is sufficient for saying there's no risk. What it's saying is they have a method that they can use to decrease the risk. I agree. There are lots of methods you can use when it comes to every single...
But it seems better.
No, what I'm telling you is the risk is still too high. You don't want to implement something like machine learning models or even procedural algorithms in the context of determining who is to be more likely or less likely the perpetrator of a certain crime. Because what we end up doing is either a single programmer's biases, in the case of procedural stuff, a single or maybe a group of programmers' biases end up being the... Okay, I couldn't hear you. But in the case of a single programmer's bias, that can end up being what manifests in procedural stuff. And a machine learning bias, whatever the biases the training data set are.
Okay, I understand it could, but this makes specific...
Just real quick, Flowtrace, I have a question about the study, and I think my audience might have that as well since they don't have access to it. In this study, do they compare people who are policing that is using this method to policing that is not? And as I understand what you read, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, it seems to be that the study said that there were better outcomes when they used this tool than when they just did not.
Yes, to be clear,
the methodology here?
Yes, to be clear, the study says, although there were disparities between ethnic demographic subgroups, everyone benefited from the increased accuracy of model-based predictions when compared with officer risk predictions. So these type of predictions as to who is more likely is already being done. Now, I understand there is still a risk, but I think the study is making a pretty good case. It's a pretty strong piece of evidence for the fact that that risk is lower than the risk we're already engaged in, where we already do these kinds of predictions, but we do it not with the biases of potentially programmers through machine learning, which is not zero, but through the much more heightened biases of individual officers going through data, reading it manually, and doing that.
Yeah. The issues, I agree that officers just reading the data manually would be worse than literally an algorithm, because police officers are going to have they're going to be even disproportionately more biased than the average person or than the average person in general society.
Is that not how it's done now? Is that not how they are doing their domestic violence prediction and thing now? Is by having officers go through the cases.
Yeah, here's the difference. Right. Here's the difference. Here's the issue. When it comes to moving from a prediction made by an algorithm to a case being made in court, there's a lot higher of a prior the average person is going to have for that police officer being biased than for a tool being biased. The average person doesn't understand how machine learning works. So when it comes to moving from a predicted crime to then moving on and moving to a court case or something, this evidence being brought into the case in court ends up being a lot more compelling for the jury than the police officer saying so.
Or is that just your inference?
Do you want an example of? Do you want examples of things like of algorithmic of stats being used in court?
To use this digital predictive tool, where that has biased the jury much disproportionately compared to the word of an officer. Do you have a case or instance that happened?
What we have are, we don't have examples of this particular tool. We have examples of stats being introduced in courts.
Other tools, right?
Yeah. Not of other tools broadly, but of other statistical models being used, right? Which are the same thing this kind of tool is. So we have other statistical models being used in court, and what we can see is that people have very, very, very strange views on statistical models when you bring them into courts. If a statistical model is completely legitimate, you can see people in you could see a jury completely toss it out because of the fact that somebody says something like, well, the math works out this way, but it's kind of unintuitive. But if you see that the math seems to intuitively bias people towards those statistical models being the kind of thing which are more likely to be accurate, even if they're not actually that accurate, you see people trusting it quite a lot. You see that because like DNA evidence, for example.
Just before you go, I want to get Hannah in there, and then you can respond, Flowtrace. Hannah, go ahead.
this will just be my, I just have a quick question on it, is because Flowtrace very specifically pointed out that this tool is going to be used in a predictive manner, not in a prosecutorial manner, excuse me. And so I suppose I'm wondering if you're foreseeing an issue where it would be admitted as evidence in a prosecutorial sense.
It absolutely is the case that
tool.
If it's a predictive tool, it's also going to end up being a prosecutorial tool. If it's a predictive tool, it's the kind of thing that, like, yeah, here was step one. Here is step one in understanding what this person might have done, or what this person might be about to do, is using this predictive tool, making sure to watch closely on this person. And so you see as a discrepancy between the kinds of people who are and aren't being paid attention to, and you see a discrepancy between the kinds of people who are more likely to then see that manifest in court.
Got you. Flowtrace, you can respond, but then I want to move off this topic to the next kind of issue. So
okay, yeah, I guess to be less responsive then, so we just put a cap on this. I don't know if I would agree that risk in of itself is enough to not sort of move forward with this kind of development at all. The thing you're talking about is also been observed. I think it's called the CSI effect with certain forensic sciences, and it is absolutely a problem. But there ought be roles, expert witnesses that are coming and saying, "Listen, this might sound very severe, but you shouldn't." And I think there's a lot better ways to address it. And I'd also like to echo the point that Hannah's making. It isn't clear based off of this law that this necessarily would be used as a prosecutorial tool for specific crimes. It draws from data from police reports. I don't know, maybe I'm naive, but it seems a lot more likely that they would then just draw on those actual specific crime reports to a jury, rather than say this AI thought they were going to do this. Well, why do they think that? Oh, because they had a prior criminal record. They have done this before. It seems like those were going to be a lot more deciding a piece of evidence than this. And that risk is there, but I don't think it's enough to not go on this program whatsoever.
Okay.
What do you think? Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
No. Ask your question. I want to put a cap on this. So.
Yeah, I just wanted to know why you thought that.
I think because the study that I've cited seems to put pretty good evidence of the fact that we can make significant improvements, such that those improvements might outweigh the risk of the CSI effect. And I think there are other sort of valves that we can use to address the CSI effect.
I didn't ask why you think this is good, right? I'm asking, why do you think that in this particular case, you don't think it's the case that we'll see the CSI effect there?
No, I'm saying you would see the CSI effect, but I don't think it's significant enough to outweigh the other benefits gained by this program. And I think that we can address the CSI effect with other things.
What kind of other things would you want that we could do that we could do that would let us keep this program?
So, for example, expert witnesses saying to the jury, "Listen, you need to understand what this is saying to you. It's not saying
people
that this
generally
is
don't trust. Yeah, people generally throw out expert witnesses.
Enough.
Yeah,
We're gonna circle the drain on this, and I want to put a cap on this, and I want to move on. Before we do though, gang, if you're following on YouTube and you like this content, like and subscribe. If you are in my Twitch chat right now, if you haven't followed, follow. And gang, I could use some support. I could use some money. Throw some bits my way. Throw some subs my way. Let me keep creating this content. We got some bangers coming up, gang. But I just wanted to shill real quick. So, yeah, give me that. I wanted to kind of get back to kind of the meat and potatoes here of this law. Katie, did you have a...
It's about the meat and potatoes. So it will send you right back to it.
Go ahead. Try it.
I want to adjust my position on the women's shelters. So I was reading up some stuff. And while it seems that women's shelters, like specifically women's shelters, are in the general guidelines for support for women, I haven't seen any clarifications anywhere into the psychological benefits. So, unless I'll be able to track down of those specific ones, I would argue then that I don't see a specific issue. I would then adjust my claim that the entrance of, like, and this answers Synth your point about trans women as well. Basically, I'd argue it's for the discretion of the therapists in the facility to decide what's the best for the overall group that is there, and it would just be up for the discretion of the caretakers instead of making like very strict rules that make no sense. Like, if there are 5 women in the shelter and they're all fine with letting a guy in, I don't see any problem why that guy shouldn't have a bed. You know, it's very simple to ask. If there's a therapist there that thinks this woman cannot handle that at all, then we'll have to find a different accommodation for that guy. It seems very simple.
Well, this is pretty agreeable. Just real quick, it seems simple, but the problem is in that last statement you made, they have to find a place if one of the women for whatever reason either does not consent,
you brought that up,
or things like that. And so
I'm glad you brought that up.
Well, just real quick, the problem that 𝕬𝖎 brought forward with the disproportional funding, right, means that there are no shelters for men, or very, very few. There's no infrastructure there to support men when they are abused. And so what he's asking and what he's pointing out is that when this new law comes into effect, if it's not already in effect, it is missing the mark and leaving men out in the cold.
Can I answer you now? Okay. So, from the little bit that I went over, it seems that the reason why there isn't a lot of financial aid being directed towards men's shelter is that because men are less in need of men's shelter, and plus the fact that they are less likely to try to utilize the sources, it's not very well funded. So the question is then, are men not requiring men-specific shelters because they don't have them? Or is it just like a need that men don't seem to have compared to women? And here, I will bring up my personal hypothesis that since we did already recognize that men experience domestic abuse in a different way than what a lot of women might, it just seems that men, when they leave domestic abuse situations, they are still not in a state where they are very like physically or emotionally traumatized, generally speaking. They're not homeless necessarily, so they don't necessarily require the shelter.
Do you have like why are you
not
saying
having
this?
Any of these issues?
Yeah, why are you saying this? Like, what evidence do you have that this is the case? Is this just a supposition?
Would you like me to send you the reports that I just
understand that, like, again,
Yes,
we're talking about the edge cases here. We're talking about the men who do become homeless, and there absolutely are many cases, not as much as women, but there are many cases where men are legitimately traumatized due to this behavior. But I know other people want to. So
See, this is what I mean about the downplaying of male victims.
This is survivor's bias.
Please elaborate. Survivor's bias?
Yeah, this seems like a case of survivor's bias in that the statistics that we have in hand aren't truly representative of what the needs truly are, because we don't have the resources in place initially to assess if they're being used or not.
I don't understand what the mechanism for filtering. You said like survivorship bias. What's the method that's filtering out the non-survivors? I don't understand.
No. So survivor's bias is a thing that they kind of came up with during World War II, right? Where they were seeing that planes that went into battle, the ones that came back, and they misaligned how best to apply armoring and changes to the plane's mechanicals in order to make them survive battle more easily. I'm saying that this seems like a case where survivor's bias is being implemented.
No, I understand what it is. I understand what survivorship bias is. No, I understand what survivorship bias is. I'm telling you that the way that survivorship bias works is there's some filtering out method, like in the case of the planes, the fact that the ones who, the bullet holes on certain planes, you don't ever see them because they don't come back, right? That's like the survivorship bias. The filtering out is those planes that they got down in enemy territory. What I'm asking is, what's the filtering?
Right. So what I am saying is we don't have good statistics to understand what male domestic abuse survivors need, because we don't have the tools in place to assess if those tools are being used and at what rate. Right?
Do you mean like we don't have the shelters to exist to see if like
I think that's what she means.
Have like a sample size? Is that what you're talking about?
Right. I'm saying that we don't have as much data, so we can't make the supposition of saying whether or not men need this.
Let me try to explain
rate as women.
Gotcha.
Yeah, let me try to explain. So when as 𝕬𝖎 has said, when men call into the National Domestic Abuse Hotline over in the UK, they are just not treated, right? And so if they are seeking help, they can't get help, and so they're not reported, right? They don't enter the system. And so they're seen as a less of a need for this because no one's calling in. And if no one's calling in, right? Then when they get their budget and they're like, well, we only had this many men call in, so we only need this much funding for that. But if what 𝕬𝖎 is saying is correct, and his hypothesis is correct, then what you're seeing is men not trying to get funding, but not being able to, not having the same resources that are available to women, so they fall through the cracks. No one knows about their need, and so their need cannot be reached. And is that an accurate representation of your position? 𝕵𝖔𝖎𝖙.
Yes.
Okay.
You're right.
And 𝕵𝖔𝖎𝖙, carry on.
And I think Hannah agrees with me there, I think.
Yes.
So I think what she was talking about survivorship bias is that, say, for example, if we only have 2 spaces available for men, and those 2 spaces are used, it would be wrong to infer from that, only 2 spaces are needed. We don't see the perhaps plethora of men that do need those spaces, but they don't have access to them. And this is... it is the case. I can't provide you any statistics right now. I'd have to look for them, but I had them up earlier. The ratio of men to women's spaces is it's abominable. There was actually a case in the US, actually in California, where the California state was sued for not providing access to male victims, access to shelters, and they won the case. Actually, I think this was back in 2007. So this is systemic on both sides of the pond, both in the UK and the US. This is an issue, and that's why I wanted to bring this to attention. I wanted to bring a panel and talk about this. It's the discrimination against men is at every level, both legislatively, policing wise, and both on an interpersonal level between men and women, between individuals. I think it's abhorrent. And I think if you care about domestic violence, we need to care about this issue.
Can I quickly engage with that? I'm not necessarily saying that you're wrong. I just want to run something by you. So if we agree that part of the issue with how funding works generally is that the government or whoever's in charge of the funding is looking at certain reach out, certain claims, certain needs in the population, and they fund. Not necessarily accordingly, but that's the thing, right? Can we call this a systemic issue if we don't know if there's a need? So I'm not saying that there isn't a need and we're not aware of it. I'm saying that we don't have the data to know if there's a need.
Yeah, because that's the level of the system doesn't even investigate it. It doesn't seem to care at all. Doesn't give a fuck. So that's a systemic issue.
So I would agree with you on that. I just think that would mean that we would need further research so we can establish there's a real need, and then hopefully we could get proper funding.
Katie, you came in supporting this law. But if this law does not address the concerns of men, right, in particular, right, it seems to sweep them under the rug.
No, it doesn't.
Okay, so why not?
It absolutely does.
So Katie, how does this law support men in a way that they don't have access to already?
Wait. You think that because this law doesn't try to address men's issues with domestic violence,
if you have a policing law, do you think it should address some systemic issues regarding policing? Like if you have a law on...
Not necessarily, no.
No? Why not?
Because I think that we need to be able to have smaller bills with specific focuses. I super agree with the sort of broad...
I get that would be ideal, but that's not how laws work right now. They're all omnibus, pretty much.
The only omnibus
in the US,
at the federal, in the US. First off, my UK politics is weak, but I don't think that is the case in the UK. And in the US, a lot of this stuff is going to be handled on a more local level, where it isn't necessarily omnibus. I super agree with 𝕵𝖔𝖎𝖙's overall point that we don't do enough for men and boys that are victims of domestic abuse. We don't deal with them. But I think the things that men and boys need are different than the things that women need, because they face domestic violence in different ways. So I think my main disagreement would just be tactics. I want to help men and boys, but I don't think that giving them shelters would really help them that much compared to a lot of the other things we could be doing for them. That's all.
Perhaps not. We don't know. There's not enough research done on this issue. We don't know what men need.
I guess the thing that is frustrating for me, and I don't know if it's a specifically online thing, but I don't think that you and I actually disagree on that much. I think the only thing where I struggle with your perspective is that it feels like you think this legislation is taking away from men to privilege women. And I just see it as so I guess
in practice
that would
it does.
So I guess that's our disagreement, because I don't see how this legislation is harming men. It is harder on it is harder on offenders, which is there to prevent the worst case of domestic violence. But we can talk about that.
The harm to men is not just like practical within not being provided enough support. It's also rhetorical as well. If you just look at the whole general like theme of the way they are presenting this, it's honestly horrible. Like if you look at there's a small section on the government website. I could link it to you, which talks about male survivors of domestic abuse. And under the section, it talks about how we know that 50% of male domestic abuse victims, 50%, do not report their abuse. And in the government's response to that, the reasoning why was because of you can guess why. Why do you think men don't report their abuse? Can you guess why? What the government stance is? Toxic masculinity.
They're better than women.
No, it's toxic masculinity. They essentially say,
that is correct,
yeah, and
right?
for me, that is, do you know what that is? That's fucking victim blaming. Do not talk about that on a government website saying, oh, men don't report their crimes because of toxic masculinity, when your bill is called Violence Against Women and Girls. Why do you think men have an issue, have a problem coming forth with their... Wait, why do you think men have a problem coming forth with their abuse? It's because the rhetoric... The rhetoric...
By invoking... By
𝕵𝖔𝖎𝖙, that's the website's point.
What?
Like what toxic masculinity means that there's self-destructive behavior.
Hannah, go ahead.
Self-destructive, exactly. Victim blaming. When men are...
𝕵𝖔𝖎𝖙, you gotta let Hannah get it out, and then you can respond to them both. I promise you. Hannah, go ahead.
Sure.
What do you mean do them both? I didn't say that.
Hannah's the only person I want to hear from right now. Hannah, finish your point. Oh no.
No, she said.
I can't hear you if you're talking.
Yeah. Oh no.
We can't see her mouth move, so we don't know.
Yeah,
if she's
we don't know
talking
if
or
she's
not.
talking.
No, she's moving. She's moving.
We can't hear you. Though,
sorry. I
go
think
ahead.
I think I had a connection issue. What I was going to say in response to 𝕵𝖔𝖎𝖙 is it's not victim blaming. By invoking the term toxic masculinity, I believe it is more of speaking to, societal perception of men showing weakness. And that is not something that, we can address in.
No, I see what you're saying. But the issue is
on this one, but
I see
what me in a moment.
I see what you're saying, and I can grant you that harmful gender stereotypes can potentially play an issue in this. Toxic masculinity could be an issue, but it's about the prioritization of what factors go into men not reporting their issues. I propose that the government stance, the whole rhetorical the thrust that is being put forth here, not including men in the name of the bill, the vast underrepresentation of men in funding is far more harmful and goes far more to men not reporting their crime than toxic masculinity. The same way as if, let's say, I do not think toxic masculinity. No, let's try this. Say, for example, under the section of where women are where it's talking about female victims of domestic abuse, it said that it would say something along the lines of, oh, we know that gender stereotypes of women being more passive and being more like society forces them to put up with issues more of being aggressed upon. Do you think that should have a place on the government's website when it's talking about female victims? I do not think it should.
It does.
I don't think it should. Absolutely shouldn't.
I think it should.
That's victim blaming. Do you think there should be a section on, for example, do you think...
That's not victim blaming. Oh my God.
I think we need...
That's the socialization of women that oftentimes they're, kind of told to not speak up. And that has been this rubber band effect that we have seen in recent years of, the Me Too movements of ending slut shaming and victim shaming and things like that. And I think that that should definitely be something that we're considering in all sorts of gender roles, whether that be toxic masculinity or not.
Toxic masculinity is the world's worst term. Toxic masculinity is the world's worst term to describe a very real concept that's absolutely what is responsible for this, right? Like 𝕵𝖔𝖎𝖙, you don't disagree. It's just that the word choice is kind of silly, right? You do agree that the reason why men don't report things like this is because of the fact they don't feel listened to. They don't feel like their concerns are important. They don't feel like they should come out and say it because it would make them weak. Make them look
precisely.
Weak.
Precisely.
That's what toxic masculinity is a really bad term, but it's the self-poisoning that they're talking about. It's just a miscommunication.
it is. I agree. It is a miscommunication, but I think it is an important one. The government. It shows that the government doesn't recognize that its own stance, right, and its own legislative at every single level. It doesn't understand that it is being far more harmful to men, and it's forcing men not to come forward with this issue, other than rather than like an internalized.
You say
I don't know,
force?
like
Can you elaborate on that? How is it forcing men not to come forward? I'm curious.
For example, with the National Domestic Abuse Hotline. Not being not accepting male victims. It's these massive. When I say force, okay, you're right. I don't mean necessarily force. It's, I guess, not accepting any male victims at all. But there are these massive barriers put in place for men that I don't think we would accept for any other situation, whether it be gender or sex or anything else.
Exactly. You guys are taught that, like, if you're the victim of domestic violence, to just like keep your mouth shut about it because it makes you look weak if you come out with it. Like, I agree. They are perpetuating that same kind of norm, but toxic masculinity, when they say that, they're not wrong about that, right? It is, in fact,
no,
bad.
They're not wrong.
But
it's a pattern. But I do not think that should have a place when the government is talking about male victims. So for me, that comes across as victim blaming. It shouldn't have a place there. There are far worse. There are far bigger reasons why men don't come forward with this.
Okay, 𝕵𝖔𝖎. Okay. Writing toxic masculinity, if they wrote it, is a bad idea because most men don't know what feminists or the government apparently it's trying to say when they're saying toxic masculinity. Okay? Now, on a government website, it is not victim blaming to say men are socialized to not reach out for help. Men are socialized to not want to display weakness. Men are socialized for X or Y. It is not victim blaming. The same way that is not victim blaming to say something that is absolutely true as well, that women are usually more financially dependent on their male partners than the other way around. Women are socialized to be more passive. Women in certain types of demographics are more likely to end up in physical domestic abuse situations. All of these things are just facts. It's not victim blaming to just state facts for education.
Can I
using toxic masculinity was
just real quick, 𝕬𝖎, let me try it. So, and correct me if I'm wrong, 𝕬𝖎. I don't have the bill in front of me, unfortunately, or the language on the website that you're referencing.
It doesn't say, but I just want to put it doesn't say, I'll look for the exact wordage, but it doesn't say toxic masculinity verbatim, but it does say harmful gender stereotypes or something like that. We know
so that's just correct.
Just real quick, just when you have a website, right, and you have a problem in your country where there are systemic barriers to a certain group or demographic seeking help, such as not having access to the national hotline, lack of funding, disproportional access to care, and then you say, well, actually, the reason men aren't coming forward, we're not going to mention all those things. We're going to talk about gender stereotypes. Do you not see that as kind of running cover for some of the failures of the government in this case?
Precisely. That's awesome. Yep.
That's great.
It's like let me try this. If it's like on the national website for rape victims, they said, well, we're going to talk about how women need to set boundaries more, and they don't mention anything else.
You know what's great, 𝕬𝖎, though, is that we have so much data about rape culture and rape statistics around women. You know what we don't have? Funding for research about male-specific issues. That is the problem. When you're talking about lack of funding...
Why don't we have the funding?
There's not going to be funding without research telling you that there's a problem. I'm not saying that there isn't a problem. I'm saying that we first need to divert resources. Before you're gonna get the funding to build and man only like women's shelters, you're going to have to show that there's data and a need for that the government is not supplying. And the lack in research is systemic to an extent, and we should do something about that.
Well, these two positions aren't even these two statements aren't even inconsistent with each other. It can be both the case that the government is down. I completely agree, right? It's like it can be both the case that the government is downplaying the harm that they're doing, and it's also the case that the reason that men don't come forward is because of gender stereotypes. Just because of the fact that the government perpetuates them doesn't mean that it's not gender stereotypes that are doing it. So I think there's not even a disagreement here.
Get Give me one more sentence.
One more
please.
sentence. Flow Trace here. This is what we talk about proportionality, okay? When women get all the speaking time, and poor Flow Trace is looking for a drop. Just a drop to get into.
Flow Trace,
No,
tell
I
him.
will not.
Tell
I
him.
will not.
Okay,
I
fuck you
already
then.
gave you one.
One more sentence. My sentence was gonna be just that, 𝕵𝖔𝖎𝖙, I actually agree with you. Because of the way the government dismisses men's issues, it is actually perpetuating negative gender stereotypes when it's telling men to pick themselves up by their bootstraps instead of providing proper funding. It's all about, oh, men don't do this, men don't report enough, men don't do that, without providing funding for research and support.
Okay. Kimberly.
Can I ask a question?
No,
Hypothetical one.
no. What? Flow Trace has the floor. We're going to wrap this up soon.
Representation,
I have a question for you, 𝕵𝖔𝖎𝖙. I've got two questions
So
for
yeah,
you.
you can respond.
Okay, sure.
And then we'll wrap this up because
Would
I
you
want to ask a
feel?
question as well, though.
Yeah. Okay. Cool. We can go back and forth. I'll do one. You do one. I'll do one. My first question is: would you feel differently if we did have the data to indicate that and I'm not saying this is the case, but if we did have the data to show that toxic masculinity or gender expectations, whatever you want to call it, was the primary reason, would you be okay with the government focusing primarily on it, or would you still be opposed to it on the basis of victim blaming?
No. If it was the case that toxic masculinity, like internalized toxic masculinity, that was not the result of any externalized forces or like a reinforcement by the government's own actions, if that was genuinely the case, then yeah, sure, I wouldn't have an issue with the government talking about it.
Okay, cool. Your question, then I'll do my second.
Yeah. So my question is: this is a bit of a diversion about this from this toxic masculinity thread, but I would just want hypothetically, let's say we had a pot of funding, £1 million or $1 million, whatever it is, and that had to cover all domestic violence sufferers. Let's say currently, if we just grant that women currently get far more funding than men do per capita, if we just had this limited pot, would you be okay with funding male victims at the expense of female victims?
Potentially, yeah. I think it would depend on how. Sorry,
yeah, sure. What about 𝕾𝖍𝖎 and 𝖓 thing?
Depending on what data
I
you
would
show
prefer.
me,
Obviously, no. Preferably, the best thing would be just to be increased funding overall. But if we just had a $1 million, whatever it is, case, a limited pot, would you be in support of deprivileging female victims and survivors?
Hannah, you can go before me.
I would be more in support of making the resources that are currently available more gender neutral rather than diverting funding.
Yeah, but that would, in effect, it would be the same, right? If we're making it more gender neutral, more funding would go to men. If it, as it currently stands, more women are getting funding.
Well, in general, yeah, I've always agreed with your initial statement that I would want to see more gender neutral language within this bill and more support to male victims. And in fact, that was going to be the bridge that I wanted to build to you of, if you had the choice, would you either want to have, one of two solutions of either have this bill have more inclusive language for male victims, or potentially have a second law invoked that targeted men more effectively?
I think gender neutral. I think we should just remove the gendered language, deprivilege remove the idea that this is a specifically gendered issue. But we can still acknowledge that women do experience domestic violence at higher rates than men. But this is not an explicitly gendered issue. 𝕾𝖍𝖎, could you answer my question?
Yeah. So. Yes, but you'll have to show me what, based on what you're doing, the disprivileging, right? So
Sure.
you'd have to make it so it accounts for the disproportionality in like the severity of harm towards women. And
Sure.
regarding the specific bill, I just want to say that I feel like I'm actually really surprised we went on this route, because I figured people would feel that the bill is misandrous because it basically mostly targets males, because most domestic abuse perpetrators are men, right? But so that's the interesting thing I get that I'm confused about from your perspective, because I don't feel like the bill is not there to address male victims as well. If anything, the bill just goes a bit crazy on men generally, preemptively. And I thought that was what's the panel is going to be about. And instead it was about like how the bill doesn't acknowledge victims of like male victims. And I don't feel like that's the case.
Really?
Yeah.
But we just went through it.
Okay.
Right, we just went
okay.
through-
Okay. I'm calling audible. I'm throwing a flag. I want to respect everyone's time. And we did slot this for 2 hours, so I want to give everyone here a chance to have a brief closing statement. Tell people where you can find you, right? And we're just gonna get at it. I would usually do with this many viewers. I would usually do an open after, but gang, I'm gonna be real with you. My brain is still fried from Max's.
Bring a mod and leave.
It was crazy. It was a lot. I want to say thank you all for being here. And gang, if you're watching on Twitch, if we get one more individual donor, we could start a hype train, and that could go really far. I want to do more of these types of content, and we got some bigger content coming up. Wednesday or Tuesday, tomorrow is my call-in stream, so you can call in and talk to me about whatever you want. Wednesday, we're going to have 𝕾𝖍𝖎𝖙 on to argue her case for queer separation and what that is, what that entails. And why we should do it in their opinion. So that will be fun. Thursday, this isn't 100% yet, but it's still in talks. But 𝕾𝖎 has reached out to me. She was disappointed in Max's performance and wanted to have a shot at talking about the Destiny Manifesto. So I'm going to let her. So I'm going to interview her on Thursday, and we will get that done. So that's what we got planned. Friday's still up in the air. We'll talk about it, but I want to give everyone here a chance to shout themselves out and tell people where they can find them. We'll start with Bunk. Bunk, go ahead. Tell people where they can find you.
Oh shit. I come on tweet my random thoughts at twitter.com/bunkpolitics. You can find me on youtube.com/@bunkpolitics, where I tend to stream and I have conversations with people about a variety of things, everything from like philosophy to general applied political things and everything in between. Yeah, that's it for me.
Where can people find you? Bunk Politics?
Yep.
Got you.
Everything.
Okay, check it out, gang. Thank you for being here and thank you for participating. Really appreciate you. Happy to have you on again. Next up, we have the drama llama himself in the flesh. Flowtrace, go ahead.
What's up, guys? My name is Flowtrace. You can check me out at twitch.tv/Flowtrace. I am live right now, and I'll be live for a while after this. Twitter.com/Flowtrace, and I am in and around the politics space. I just want to give a big shout out to Wick for putting this thing together. All my fellow panelists. It got heated, but I thought there was actually a really productive conversation. I thought there was actually a lot of awesome back and forth here. And of course, all the viewers on the many different streams, because you folks are the ones that make it all possible. So thank you.
Thank you. Lonerbox, thank you for the raid. I really appreciate you. Yeah, you're raiding out when we're ending, but thanks for being here, gang. And yeah, we'll see where we go next. But yeah, welcome in. Hope you enjoy. I heard you were watching my my little interview. I'm curious what you think. And if you want more interview stuff, like I said, Thursday we're gonna be interviewing 𝕬𝖎𝖙 about the Destiny report. So tune in. Hannah, go ahead. Hannah, sorry, apologies.
No, you're good. You're good. You can't find me anywhere other than in the walls of Twitch. You know me from all the mini chats. I don't stream. I don't really make any content. I want to say thank you to Wick so much for having me on for my first panel ever. Everybody, like, comment, subscribe, give Wick that love, sub, bits, donos, everything you can. Support this man and for all the content he gives us. And I do want to add just one tiny last thing on the matter of domestic abuse, particularly in the U.S. I will say that I am very closely affiliated with a blues festival that raises money for a gender-neutral crisis center here in New England.
Beautiful. Well, thank you for being here, and thank you for choosing WhickTV to make your debut. Masked Crusaders are welcome. Hannah, always appreciate you. Always like to see you. Next up, we have Kimberly herself. Dat Katie, go ahead. Dat Katie.
3 things. First, if Flowtrace will continue streaming, you should raid him. Second, if anyone is interested, I would love to continue this conversation. We don't fucking need Wick. We'll just keep going without him. Third, Osmark, I feel like the language of the bill is pretty gender neutral. The only thing that isn't is the title. That is what I went That is what I meant. We can fight over it more when we continue the panel, because Wick is a coward and doesn't want to do the open. I'm 𝕵𝖎𝖙. Find me on Twitch.
Gang, go check her out. Despite appearances, I actually like Katie, and I like having her on. She's interesting, and she challenges me, and that's fun. And so, whereas you may not need me, I hope that you want me. Next up, Synth, please. Where can people find you?
Yeah, I'm actually surprised that Bunk, upon hearing that 𝕬𝖎 is going to be on the show, didn't plug like that they're about to be uploading their debate with 𝕬𝖎, where they blow her the fuck out on trans issues. So disappointed in Bunk for that. You can.
Well, I mean, dude, it was the most AIDS conversation ever.
It was.
Okay? I actually.
It was actually
really. By the end of that
give him some views, y'all. Come on.
Holy
Bunk
shit!
out here.
Okay,
go look at
my
Bunk.
brains out.
Go look at Bunk's channel.
Bunk
Bunk uploads like the same kind of content that I do, like lefty stuff, but Bunk actually uploads. I'm on YouTube. Open up a new tab right now. Open up a new tab on your browser. Type in youtube.com/SINTHE, synth or Cindy, right? Press enter and go subscribe right now. I really enjoyed being on the panel. This is my first Wick panel, but I thought it was really well done. I really enjoyed the other side's arguments a lot as well. Especially Katie's were really stand out. It's really especially compelling. But I enjoyed being here, and thanks for having me on.
Oh, thanks for being here, and thanks for choosing WhickTV to come and yell. I don't know if this went well, but it was entertaining. So that's really what it boils down to in the end. So appreciate you, and yeah, we'll have you on again in the future. And certainly, last but not least, the reason we're having this discussion in the first place, the man with a plan, toxic masculinity personified, 𝕬𝖎. Go ahead. Where do people find you?
Yeah, you can find me on YouTube @/𝕬𝖎. I'm going to be making a video about this topic. I got into all of this and I wanted to hear other people's opinions and perspectives. So yeah, you can find me there. Shout out to Wick for hosting this. Great as always. That's it.
Okay, Flowtrace, are you streaming after this?
Yes, I am.
Well, Katie says so. Katie gets to direct me today. And we'll rate out.
I'm sorry for misgendering you, Synth.
It's okay.
Yeah, and gang, like I said, tune in tomorrow, 6 p.m. Eastern. We're gonna have a call-in show with a surprise guest host. It's a surprise to me too, because no one's gotten back to me yet, and we'll figure that out. But then yeah, it's a show where you can call in and talk to me about any take I've had, anything I've done that you have a problem with, or if you want to praise me, that's cool too. And yeah, you can talk to me then. Wednesday, 6 p.m. Eastern. Again, we're going to talk about queer separation. And Thursday, time to be determined. But Thursday, we're going to have 𝕬𝖎 on and interview her. So with that, we'll rate out. Bye-bye. Bye, everyone. Bye. Okay, now three of the chatters. No, thank you all for being here.
Let's see. Oh, well, they're still here with me, to be clear. I'm still live.
That was epic, dude. I'm gonna get
Just
back
to be clear, I'm
to
still live.
Yeah,
oh,
that was
Sid,
fun.
do you want to see the visualization for the audio that I did for the live conversation? All right, sick.
Love you.
So wait, you did a conversation with 𝕬𝖎?